Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm Dr. Amanda Clinton, the Senior Director for the Office of International Affairs at the American Psychological Association. On behalf of the Global Psychology Alliance and its 68 member associations, I would like to personally welcome you to Psychology in Action, Leading for the Climate. This gathering is the result of years, yes, years, of hard work, dedication, trust, and daring from a group of extraordinary leaders in the field of psychology. They hail from every continent across the globe. The Alliance's efforts to come together as a profession and science has its origins in the interest of working on issues that are too big for any one association to address independently. This endeavor started in earnest in 2019 when APA and the Portuguese Order of Psychologists co-hosted the inaugural International Summit on Psychology and Global Health, a leader in climate action. Over 50 chief executives, presidents, and high-level representatives from national, regional, and international partner organizations came together for this initial summit, which was held in Lisbon, Portugal. Over the course of 2.5 days, the participants worked together to identify action-oriented, evidence-based resources for psychology, psychologists, and the people and communities they serve, in a unique, I dare say one-of-a-kind effort to create contextually specific pathways under an umbrella of shared goals. The Lisbon Summit planted the seeds that allowed the Global Psychology Alliance to grow and flourish. Subsequent to its initial engagement, the Alliance continued to meet and focus its efforts on actively and meaningfully addressing critical challenges facing humanity. In 2020, this meant addressing psychological aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic in combination with continued climate efforts. And that brings us to 2021. The past 2 years, the Global Psychology Alliance has grown from its roots in Lisbon. It has increased in membership while continuing to solidify its model of team-oriented interaction that emphasizes inclusivity, mutual respect, equity, and diversity. The Alliance has worked to design, produce, and share resources for our members, as well as our communities across the world, in dozens of languages and with consideration to cultural adaptations for specific contexts, while simultaneously elevating psychology on key global stages. Most recently, and ergo this meeting, the Alliance gave voice to psychological science and practice in relation to the Climate Change Summit that the United Nations organized, or COP26, in Glasgow, Scotland. Tonight and tomorrow, this Psychology in Action Leading for the Climate event will highlight the accomplishments of the Alliance at COP26, while also specifically aiming to advance our understanding of the ways in which psychological science can contribute to addressing the impacts of the climate crisis. To achieve these goals, we invited a range of inspiring leaders in business, community-based action, grassroots advocacy, systems and behavior change, and education, who have incorporated psychological principles into their change initiatives. Psychology in action, with an evidence base, of course, is an idea that the Alliance takes quite literally. For which reason, this event highlights ways in which we can all get involved and create change, even if the path forward continues to be a winding one. We hope that each of you, upon your virtual departure from this meeting, has at least one concrete idea about where you might begin your efforts as a member of your own professional organization and or within your own community. Before turning the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Ramalho, I would like to say a few thank yous. First, none of this would have been possible without the help of colleagues, leaders, and staff from the Order of Portuguese Psychologists, the American Psychological Association, This Is Consulting, and of course, all of my colleagues in the Global Psychology Alliance. I further wish to thank my own team, Julie, Gabe, Ellen, Papa, and Rosanna. Without you, it is not an exaggeration to say this would not have been possible. In closing, I remind you that UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez recently stated, "This is a moment of truth and transformation for all people and for our shared planet." I can say myself, as a kid who grew up in Alaska near the Arctic Circle, where snowy winters are now often dry and immense glaciers have receded so far behind mountains that they're no longer visible to the naked eye, that is all too obvious that the time is now. It is time to act with urgency as well as hope, as the Secretary General has indicated. The Global Psychology Alliance is taking action and asks you, our members, our colleagues, and friends, to do the same. Psychology has much to contribute, so let's all lead for change. Thank you, and I cede the floor to Dr. Ramalho.
So thank you, Amanda. I guess you can all hear me. And I would like also to tell you that after the internationally recognized summit on climate change and global health that took place in Lisbon in November 2019, this special leadership team, which Amanda focused, of 68 psychology associations all over the world from the 5 continents, this is the Global Psychology Alliance, was coordinated by APA, was coordinated by Amanda. And I would like to thank you, Amanda, for leading these 68 psychology associations and for coordinating all the efforts that have been doing by these 68 representations, country representations, and for the commitments to address the global health, climate change, and also COVID-19 challenges, using psychological science, policy, and practices in a very global level. This is really important for all of us. And I would like to thank also all Global Psychology Alliance, all the countries that were there with us after summit to work on the proclamation and the resolution that we started in Lisbon, and to bring it to a higher level, a platform that we together created, sharing these track records, sharing expertise, and sharing all resources. And thank you also for updating all the work done since Lisbon conference. And it has really an important impact on the continuing of the recognition of climate change, climate crisis, and mental health. And these COVID-19 pandemics reinforced this recognition and brought a set of expert knowledge on this issue. And this Global Psychology Alliance tried to ensure some new positioning and to give bigger steps and to have other action plans, such as supporting and creating new opportunities to have new inputs, to share best practices, to join efforts to participate in global initiatives, and to helped in the connection with the stakeholders. I would like also to tell you that APA, together with this Global Psychology Alliance, also welcomed a Global Psychology Learning Leadership Institute to bring together established leaders and emerging leaders from 30 psychology associations from every continent, and fostered mentor and mentee relationships across these countries and cultures. This is really important to the advancement of psychology's role in addressing these critical global issues, and to set the agenda for next years, at least until 2025. And I would also like to share with you that GPA has been forming some working groups that will continue to build some new themes on climate crisis, like toolkits for psychologists, like electing some key challenges, like toolkits to address anti-science sentiments, and toolkits also for behavior change. And all these global joint collaboration will undoubtedly strengthen Global Psychology Alliance and this global community of psychologists. And we had a picture of that on COP26, because in COP26, being there as Global Psychology Alliance was really important to bring attention to a set of 68 countries that are worried in putting psychological science at the service of climate crisis and global health. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy this event, this 2 days event, and thank you all for being interested and participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. For the next few minutes, we are going to take some time for the 5 psychologist representatives who attended the COP26 meeting in Glasgow on behalf of the Global Psychology Alliance to share their takeaways and potential next steps. First will be Terry Morrissey of This Is Consulting. Next, Richard Plenty, This Is Consulting, and the APA Climate Task Force. Following Nicola Gale, who is the GPA representative for the European Federation of Psychologists Associations. Following Sofia Ramalho, who represents Portugal at the Global Psychology Alliance. And then as time allows, I will add comments myself. So Terry, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks for the privilege of attending COP26 in Glasgow for the last 2 weeks. My initial impressions of this event was it was a vast operation with 7 very large areas dedicated to different types of activity, including media, side events, country partners, and country offices where delegates could meet representatives and thrash out their agreements behind the scenes. There were over 200 countries represented at the COP26. And it was amazing that they could reach any kind of consensus given the number of countries that were there. There were 60 countries with country pavilions showcasing their work on climate change, and also hosting a series of talks and events for the delegates to attend. Key takeaways for me were, the first was the need to really connect and to collaborate with other global alliances. For example, scientists warning on climate, to bring psychology into the conversation. I think a second one was to link in with our country representatives and to continue the awareness raising and trying to influence policy. Thirdly, we had an opportunity to speak out about behavior change and the role that psychologists could take in behavior change, as we see ourselves as experts in changing behavior and changing systems. I think also we had the opportunity to highlight the role of leadership and the importance of leadership in climate action. For the GPA itself, I think it's important that we continue to produce short briefing notes which we can send out to our country representatives and to get involved in policy. And finally, I think it's really important that we continue in the Global Alliance to educate psychologists and their members in the role that psychology can play in this very important issue for our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. Richard Plenty.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. First, let me say it was a great privilege to be at COP26 in person as a member of the GPA team and in the Blue Zone as well, right in the center of things. And it felt to me like the GPA had come really quite a way since Terry and I facilitated the Lisbon Summit, which was just 2 years ago. For me personally, meeting people face to face really brought things to life. You get a feeling for the deep level of concern people have about climate change, and everybody I met recognized the significance of the problem. And you also get a deeper understanding for some of the issues, particularly climate justice, and of course, the challenge of transformation and change, which everybody faces. Being at the conference for a number of days, as Terry said, gave us the opportunity to make some very good connections. We were able to explore things further with people in government and organizations that we already had some contact with, and many of those were at a very high level. But we also made new connections with many others, people in the country pavilions, people who were giving presentations, and people we actually just sat down next to. It was that kind of event. So, of course, whenever we met people, we did our best to promote psychology. But what I noticed was that psychology didn't need much selling. We received a very positive response from people when we talked to them. And in particular, attitudes and behaviors were very much on everybody's minds. Perhaps that's not surprising, because the transition at pace and on a global scale of our energy, transportation and other systems is a massive and complex change challenge with lots of moving parts. There'll be winners and losers as new technologies are introduced and old ones phased out, and social, political and economic systems adjust. So that will require leadership at all levels of our societies if it is to be successful. So what does it mean for us? Well, I now have no doubt that as psychologists, we will be asked to help as time goes on. The question will be, what can we deliver? It's important for us not just to draw attention to the problem, but to be able to offer help and practical advice to ensure we are part of the solution. So how do we go about that? Well, we've already made the key first step in connecting psychology associations with each other. Now we should make sure our associations are well connected, not only with each other, but with community, organization, and national leaders who are addressing climate change. And I believe the best way of doing that is to revisit and strengthen all the individual psychology association plans on climate change that we developed in Lisbon, to share them more widely and ensure they're relevant and helpful to those who need our support.
Thank you so much. Nicola Gale.
Again, thank you very much, Amanda, for the opportunity to represent European psychology at COP26. It certainly was, as my colleagues have said, a real privilege. A big thing that struck me in terms of COP26 is the unifying power of the climate emergency in bringing people together. This was evident to me at COP26 from the sheer number of delegates, the energy in the protests outside, the range of organisations present, the high quality exhibitions that people have put huge effort into, and also the huge media interest. In the sessions, there were government ministers, the third sector, businesses, all engaged. Obviously some with different motives, wanting different things, but by and large, all actually united in doing something about the climate emergency. The power of communities at different levels to try for change was evident, as was also how easily some more marginalised voices seemed to go unheard. In particular, I noticed the hunger from the young for education and change that was really on display in the protests as speakers. And it was a touching exhibition of children's letters. I noticed a very short and to the point letter from a 9-year-old to their teacher, Miss So-and-so, that said simply, "Please, can you make a lesson about climate change?" Another key reflection for me was on what is joined up and what is separate. The big issues of decarbonisation and food, forestry and nature are only just being brought together, it was apparent. Then we had the technocratic solutions, a lot of expertise, a lot of thought, a lot of thinking going into those, but they tended to remain separated from the human processes. For a plenary I attended, though, this was different. This session was an Indonesian UK initiative called FACT, and that stood for Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade. Here, there was real evidence, I thought, that the skills, opportunities and needs of peoples were being seen as a primary focus of intervention. This was about protecting and restoring the forests, reforming the food and farming system, but doing so taking into consideration the needs of smallholders for their livelihoods and the indigenous peoples as the guardians of the land. So what does this mean for the Global Psychology Alliance and for psychologists globally? It seems to me there's a lot of potential for psychology working at the community level to engage people for change. This, I think, means a role for the GPA and also for national, regional and international psychology bodies in bringing together community psychologists and community psychologists as specialists, that is, but also psychologists as a community of professionals. Psychologists can draw on shared narratives of how to do this in different cultures and in different circumstances. There's a role too, I think, for psychology in bringing attention to the human factors, using the knowledge base to support behaviour change. And this needs to include the systemic level of social infrastructure and not just pointed individual changes. So what governments, public bodies, organisations need to put in place needs to be a key part of the intervention from psychologists. Supportive of people interventions is really important, that matters, but it is interventions supporting change that will actually help solve the climate problem.
Thank you. Sofia Rahmalo.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Amanda, and GPA and APA for the opportunity for this committee to be there in COP26, such a tremendous event and so important event. And thank you for the feeling of interconnectivity that it created more and more in me, particularly, but also that I could bring to Portugal and to the way of to my vision of this and global health theme that we want to ensure. And which was the context? The context was facing human being basic needs of protection, of safety and security, of social adequacy and activation of the support networks. This is a context. And it was also a context of human rights, health, education, equity, equality, inclusion, so on. And it was also a context where we talked about climate crisis and the way it affects in a profound way psychological health and well-being, in particular to vulnerable groups. Migration, poverty, social inequalities, and global threats to peace are some of the impacts. And yes, it is also experienced in developing countries, such as we can see the impacts of COVID and of pandemic, because climate changes can have an impact in pandemic crisis and other future pandemics, of course. So what COP26, what are COP26 main keywords and actions that we want and we can mobilize? So I will just emphasize some keywords like adaptation and adaptability. That's what we can mobilize as psychologists to the adaptation to climate changes, to new routines and life and cultural transitions, to new behaviors that can maintain a positive perception of well-being and life quality. Another keyword is mitigation, together with literacy, especially literacy in psychological health, like communication plans regarding policies, population and behavior change, grounded in scientific evidence and, of course, psychological science evidence. It's resilience and hope in terms of capacity building and overcoming in a way that we can exceed ourselves. And it's also eco-anxiety, loss and damage that psychologists can help to face. And also psychologists can help to implement now with action plans and roadmaps, and with collaboration through collective action and also social cohesion. And through this international Global Psychology Alliance, and with help of youth participation and empowerment, of course. So we expect now for COP27 in Egypt with lessons learned. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll wrap up. We have just 2 minutes, so I'm going to take a bullet point approach. The thought is from my colleagues who preceded me, or just, absolutely brilliant and spot on. So in a very concrete way, I would like to add, there was a very intriguing learning lesson for us, which is the way in which the COP meetings are organized is actually the same kind of framework in which the Global Psychology Alliance works. That is, there are global metrics, but there are local implementation plans. So effectively, what the Alliance has always tried to do is have a shared vision that we need to address specific problems, but funnel that down so that it's meaningful within each of our own particular contexts, communities, whether it's linguistic, sociopolitical, historical, etc. The Alliance understands, psychology understands how this model works. Ergo, we are prepared to start taking action, developing meaningful tools, and really contributing to this process. I would also add that power in numbers was an incredible takeaway, that we should all keep in mind that when we're talking to community members, neighbors, or high-level leaders, and we want them to join us, where there are lots of us, we're almost 70 countries that are working together, the idea becomes much more intriguing, it becomes much more powerful. And we're fortunate that we experienced that when we were at COP, and we certainly can continue to build on that. I also think the education piece, it was not infrequent for us to get a rather surprised response. What is psychology doing here? When the space was about renewables or about financing. And certainly short conversations led to a lot of interest and greater understanding. We can do that. This is an effort to start by educating ourselves. I think many of us are still having challenges figuring out where we can start on this issue. And again, that's the name of this meeting. But certainly there's a big opening at in spaces like COP26, 27 for psychology to convey what it is it has to share with others. And so with that, I will close this summary discussion and go ahead and turn the floor over to Mark Foley, who is the Chief Executive Officer of EirGrid Ireland, and one of those truly innovative leaders that we spoke about when we were first bringing the meeting to the floor. So Mark, welcome and thank you.
So I'm trying to get my video in play. I'm in, okay, and I'm going to try and share my screen on my PowerPoint. 1 second, please, which I'm struggling with. And okay, that's not working. 1 sec. I think I'm in. Okay. Ooh, 1 second. Share screen. Okay, are we in? Can you see my slides, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So look, firstly, just great to be here. Good evening, good night, and good morning, because I know we're in all parts of the globe this evening. From my perspective, it's 1 a.m. in the morning in Ireland. But great to be here and lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you 1 week after COP26, which I had the great privilege and indeed the pleasure to attend. My board asked me yesterday, Mark, was COP26 a success or a failure? And it was probably the toughest question I've had in a long time. And I'm not sure I know the answer, and I'm going to leave this to the Q&A maybe at the end of my presentation. I'm not going to be brave enough to front up and answer it now. Look, I'm 60 years of age. I have 3 sons and 2 beautiful grandsons aged 2 and 4. I'm a chemical engineer by original training. I became a senior manager at 28 years of age and spent a lot of my career, half of my career in US multinationals, and the second half of my career rather uniquely in the semi-state sector in Ireland. And I've worked in heavy process industry, specialty chemicals, electronics, large-scale infrastructure, renewable energy, and energy utilities. So there's a particular Irish phrase many of you might be familiar with, which is, I've been around the houses, and I'm advised by my wife in particular, I should write a book when I retire in 4 years' time. But most importantly, I have spent my career, I suppose, most wanting to make a difference. And the pinnacle of my career has been my appointment as CEO of EirGrid, the transmission system operator for Ireland. We operate both the power system and the market across the island of Ireland, across 2 jurisdictions in the last couple of years. And I think Ireland is a great microcosm for the challenges facing the global world as we see it today. I'm going to start with a short, maybe little personal anecdote around my leadership journey. I live in Newcastle, small village, 40 kilometers south of Dublin. It's got a pub and it's got a petrol station, nothing else. Me and my wife have been minding my mother-in-law for many years. She's got dementia, and for those of you who have been up close with dementia, it's a horrific and debilitating disease. And little story about 2 years ago, pre-COVID, my routine was up at 6 a.m., put my gym gear on, go into the kitchen, make my coffee, work, get myself into the office. Pre that, I would do a workout in the gym and get myself into the office for 8:15. And I was in my kitchen at 6:15, and my mother-in-law ghosted into the kitchen. It was making my coffee, and it was quite scary because this figure suddenly appeared in front of me. And I got quite a shock, and I said, Joan, you need to go back to bed. And she looked at me and she says, what are you doing, Mark? And I said, I'm going to work. And she then said, do you like it? And I said, yes, I do. And I said, Joan, time to go back to bed. It's 6:15 in the morning. And then she asked that sort of incredible question that for those of you with young children might be used to. She asked that why question. And I was there kind of shivering, trying to get out of the house and get to the gym before work. And she asked me why. And I was completely thrown by the question. And it took me about probably a minute or two to respond. And I said, Joan, I said, because I get to make a difference. And that really sums up what I'm about, what my leadership proposition is about. Every morning I get up, I know I have the opportunity, the privilege, and indeed the obligation to make a difference as the leader of a major corporation in Ireland at the cutting edge of the fight against climate change. And when
Mark,
we get
forgive me.
into,
It's, oh, there it goes. We can see him now. Okay.
and when we get into the climate emergency, what are we talking about? I think the debate is over. If you look at this data, which I stole, and I don't apologize for it, from McKinsey's, it says atmospheric carbon dioxide trundled along between 280 and 300 parts per million for 800,000 years. But now we're at 419 parts per million. And frankly, it's heading exponential. I picked up a lovely tweet from a PhD student only from France in the last 2 days, who started to follow me on Twitter. And what she said was, I'm 21 years of age. When I was born, atmospheric carbon dioxide was at 371 parts per million. It's now at 413. And I think the debate is over about the science of global warming, and COP26, notwithstanding the complex and political debates that have taken place, at least we've stopped talking about the science. Everybody is accepting the science, and there's only two things left in play, which is the speed of response from global leaders and who's going to bear the financial burden. We have finally got to the real questions, not whether it's real or whether it's not. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, here's a map of the world, and here's Ireland in the, I suppose, the periphery of Europe, and maybe an inconsequential country from your perspective. You might look at Ireland as a lovely place to go on holidays, the best free-range beef in the world, Guinness or aged whiskey, U2, Sinead O'Connor, maybe even Westlife if you're that desperate, James Joyce for literature, and indeed last Saturday in sport when we trashed the New Zealand All Blacks in rugby. We're an extraordinary, small but special country. More seriously, an open economy and a serious heavy hitter. The European headquarters of 9 of the top 10 global corporations, pharmaceutical corporations in the world. The European headquarters of all of the top global ICT companies in the world. Irish originating global corporations are world leaders in food, fintech, construction, technology, and services. And believe it or not, we are in the top 2 countries in the world in terms of renewables on a power system, and number 1 for an island system in terms of renewables. That's where the story really starts. Back in 2008, a Green minister, as part of a coalition government, set a policy objective in our country for 40% of our electricity should come from renewable energy by 2020. This is Eamon Ryan, current Minister for Energy. Most people thought this was insane, lunatic fringe policy, typical Green Party ideology, and even the sophisticated element of the ecosystem, namely the engineers, said it couldn't be done because we would be defying the laws of physics. Guess what? Ireland achieved 43% of all of its electricity from renewable sources in 2020, 6 months ago. The bulk of which came from onshore wind. We've built the best ecosystem in the world for onshore wind development, and I'm proud to be part of that ecosystem. My company, EirGrid, delivered some of the most sophisticated and world-leading engineering solutions that have allowed the island, an island synchronous system, to be able to accommodate 70% renewables on a power system on an instantaneous basis. No other country in the world has done that. A leader in the political domain set down a challenge, policymakers backed that leadership, and an ecosystem of private and public sector developers responded and delivered for 2020. Think about it. Real and inspiring visionary leadership drove a massive ecosystem, and in the investment proposition equated to billions of investment, lower cost ensued to customers, and a massive reduction in carbon was delivered in the Irish power system in 2020. That is leadership, that is courage. As we talk about the Irish experience, both past and future, and the ambition, I'd like to start with the words of the greatest, in my view, leader of the last 100 years, Nelson Mandela. And he said, there is no passion to be found in playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living. And when we talk about the climate challenge in front of us, it is not about engineering. It is not about technology. It is fundamentally about leaders being prepared to stand up, be counted, and create the pathway to a new green and low carbon future. Where's my slides on? Sorry, folks, I've lost my presentation. Give me a sec. Can you see that now? Is that visible? Hello? Hello?
No.
Can't see it, Mark.
Hang on one
Yeah,
sec.
it's not visible. We can't see it.
One sec.
Okay.
I'm going to finish on this slide proposition. Can you see that now?
We see a new vision for Ireland, Mark.
Good. I'm going to try and get it into portfolio mode. Can you see it? So look, going to make a couple of points. Number one, the same minister who you saw in 3 slides back has said our ambition for 2030 is 70 to 80% renewables on our power system. EirGrid's strategy speaks fundamentally and definitively to that ambition. We have built 4 pillars around our strategy. Number one, thought leadership. When I got my team around a table 3 years ago and said, we will be thought leaders, many of them said, we can't do that, we shouldn't do that. And I said, we must be thought leaders because we are at the epicenter of the transition. Our job is to be thought leaders. Our job is to be brave. Our job is to be courageous. Secondly, we launched last week the proposition called Shaping Our Electricity Future. And that was about a vision for 2030 and a pathway to get there. We finally have offered the people of Ireland not just the picture of the future, but the roadmap to get there. Thirdly, we offered a new engagement proposition as part of our thought leadership and Shaping Our Electricity Future proposition. We engaged in the most far-reaching engagement proposition with the people of Ireland, never before seen by a state company. Hundreds of engagements across youth, civil society, county councils, government, politicians, etc. And we said, come with us on the journey, listen to our proposition, and please give us your views. It was described by our Prime Minister as the best piece of public engagement ever undertaken by a state company. And finally, we've said, we can't do this alone. We have engaged upwards of 15 global world-class partners from great companies to work with us on delivering an ambition of a power system that can handle up to 100% renewables. So we have a plan, we are leading out, we have engaged in a way that nobody else has ever done, and we are ready to deliver something that no country in the world has ever delivered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll move to Brian Dixon.
Tēnā koutou katoa. That's the Indigenous Maori greeting from Aotearoa, New Zealand. That's to all of you everywhere that you are across your time zones. We wish to pay respects to the peoples of our places, the current peoples, past and future. Many of those peoples are in Pacific nations, and they're at the forefront of climate change. And their communities really deserve our priority attention when we're considering how we as a profession can engage with communities. For them, it's their land, their culture, their history, their futures, their economies, and all. That's all at stake. And we need to be hearing their voices. We need to be responding to what they're asking and need to adapt our profession to be able to do that. I'll start the screen share. That's shifted.
Are you looking for full screen, Brian?
Just trying to bring this into focus for you.
Great.
So you're not seeing what you don't need to see. It was set before, but now it's not. Okay. So is that showing?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So it's a great honour to be able to talk to you. I think it's done what Mark's did, hasn't it? I'll shift it back. Sorry, I did think it was all right. Just these technical glitches happen. Okay. So the situation that we're describing, globally, COP26 has been described as a bit of a mixed bag. There have been incremental changes, and those have been described as not quite enough. Partly because of this, you know, that even with the targets that were offered prior to COP26, we were going to overshoot by a considerable degree, a few degrees. And the point of that now is that that's been refined. I think the figure now is 2.4 degrees Celsius by standards of emissions reduction. Further on the situation, so you know, we know that in the Pacific regions, the blue whale in the room at COP26 was this, and this was the Foreign Minister of Tuvalu in his address to COP26. These were areas which the Americans developed in the Second World War, which were on land, and this is the top of structures that were on land. That's now 30 meters inside the sea. Locally, we know that Vancouver 2 days ago suffered incredible floods. We know that in my own country, we've had successive winters. The latest 2021 just finished was the warmest ever on record, and it was the 7th in a row that's been well over average. Around Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have major effects because we're coastal and we're reliant on agriculture, and we have incredible rainfalls. We have once in 200-year events twice this winter. So what's psychology got to do with it? Well, whatever the level, that there are people involved in one way or another. And as Robert Gifford said, reported in the APA Monitor in 2018, climate change is the result of 7.6 billion people making decisions every single day. And that right there makes it a psychological problem. And of course, that's not even considering the problems that are created by climate change. So the levels of engagement for psychology, so at that international level, we have groups and collaborations like the GPA. There are geopolitical regions, and a number of you are in those regional organisations, and we're trying to establish an Asia Pacific one. Then there's national level organisation, which is what most of our associations belong to or work at. And then there's the local level. We tend to actually ignore our role to a large extent at that local level. But that is incredibly important. So thinking about what can happen at those levels. So we tend to focus on the international and the national strategies for interventions and lobbying. But we might be forgetting that the bread and butter focus of our profession is at individual and group levels and organisational change. And that brings us to our communities, where our ability to influence change may in fact be greater, as well as engaging more of our colleagues in collective action that has more meaning for them. So central governments have really important roles. They provide a policy level framework infrastructure that's necessary for changes to happen. They create legislation, regulations, and they ensure that appropriate sanctions and penalties, incentives, guidelines, etc. in place, and funding. They need to be asserting those high-level interventions like limiting fossil fuel extraction, the trading and use of that, and managing methane and engaging in international efforts. Our own Ministry for the Environment described that in our statement on its website, that the central government provides a framework and right through to responding to natural hazards. So generally mitigation efforts and considering what can be done in response in terms of adaptation, immediate and longer term. But eventually we have to acknowledge that most meaningful climate action relies on the individuals, the people in our communities, people in our organisations, people in the sectors, such as Mark has been describing the efforts in Ireland. We need to make changes in the attitudes, thinking and behaviours at all of those levels. Nations, after all, are collections of people. Organisations, businesses, industries are people too. Rod Oram is a journalist, business journalist and commentator, mainly online now, but still with some columns. A few years ago, he visited 3 cities. He wrote a book called Seeking Hope in the Anthropocene. And it's a fascinating read. Just paraphrasing him, he said he contacted radical practical thinkers, people in business, academia, science, government, and politics. He wanted to ask them about how the economy and ecology will be, what the nexus will be in 10 years' time. Will economies be less damaging to the ecosystems. Will continued growth just mean more damage? He visited Beijing, he visited London, he visited Chicago, and for those reasons that are described there. He said, I came home feeling more optimistic and purposeful, with a deep appreciation for the people I had met and the work that they do. They're giving us half a chance to work with the ecosystem, not against it. He said these are strong learning communities with essential attributes of common sense, like understanding what's going on, with a common purpose, like responding effectively, and common wealth, like sharing economic, ecological, and societal benefits. In these communities, he said, individuals are valued, helped, and encouraged, and in return, they participate and change. They help others change. So they're quite inspiring sort of insights. Another of our economists and a podcaster observed what happens in our councils, and he said it suddenly dawned on him what was happening in Auckland's Town Hall, old council chambers, grey halls. He said, I realised this was where the future would be decided. There wouldn't be highly charged conscience or confidence votes in Parliament or grand speeches about climate emergencies or the future of the nation's finances. He said councillors and mayors are actually now the most important politicians in the land, not the Prime Minister, Cabinet, members of Parliament. And that's because local government will be where the battles are fought, street by street, house by house in the years to come. He said our Parliament might think that it's actually able to order changes, get carbon zero by 2050. But those hopes could easily be dashed by simply a ratepayer revolt from the suburbs next year at having to pay excessive rates and other utility bills. So a reaction to COP26 that I picked up on Twitter the other day, at the end of the day, it will be action on an individual level, on a city level, and a regional level that we have to rely on. We can't trust government or companies. It's up to every one of us to change our habits. It's not from a world expert or authority. It was from a chap in Australia, simply responding to Sky News reports on what they saw as the limitations of the whole exercise. And for Australia, that was very clear. Okay, so I've been doing a bit of participant observer work this year in true community psychology style, I guess. I've been getting involved. So I've been participating in the local government processes, been making submissions, speaking at hearings on draft 10-year plans. I did this as a citizen ratepayer resident. Been expressing interest in and concern about their policy and their inaction, particularly about climate change issues. I've made written submissions and I've actually attended the hearings for the City Council, 2 regional councils and a district council, and it's been rather fascinating. My observations from the councillors and staff, some were positive, welcoming. Others were polite, but rather restrained, if you like, tolerant. Some showed outright confusion and suspicion of me. You know, what's a person who's known as a psychologist doing here? What have we done wrong? Many in the organisations, both staff and elected representatives, have shown a clear interest. They've requested the material that I've offered, or they've arranged follow-up contact and meetings. A positive approach helped, you know, praising them for the efforts they were making, even if it was sometimes a little hard to find ways, things to praise. So plans about climate change were very variable, but here's a rather good example of something being done well. So it's from the Regional Council of the Waikato, it's the middle of our North Island. And it's their roadmap, Climate Action Roadmap. And they've set out, they've identified the global context in simple, clear ways, New Zealand's response to that, and their local issues. they've got that rather right. You know, they're explaining how it all fits together, those levels that I described earlier. And they've set out 9 areas that they're addressing and provided considerable detail. It's actually worth a look on their website to see what they're doing. So what's the problem? Looks rather good. The only trouble is they're very adept at developing policy. They employ and contract experts, but there's a bit of a problem. It's mostly in what councils do. Their engineering, their planning, biological sciences, their HR. Where they need help is ensuring that the policy is fit for purpose, communicating with their communities and encouraging input, making collaborative decisions, and providing information resources to their people. These are things that they actually have some difficulty doing. So our councils can benefit from the knowledge, skills, and expertise that psychologists and other professionals too have if we show them how that can happen. So what do we know about engaging with communities on climate change? Starting point is Susan Clayton and Christine Manning's book, 2018 book on climate change, psychology and climate change. Lovely, lovely book, nicely written. And in one of the chapters there, they actually look at psychological perspectives on community resilience and climate change. They point out that it's really important to understand that resilient communities need planning, development, and an infrastructure to help them adapt. Communities tend to have an attachment to place and are familiar with local problems. They possess social capital and interconnectivity between their members. And their programs and grassroots organising is really important to be able to respond to local issues. It's also about fostering community participation in the plans, because that in itself can increase community competence and participation. Thinking now of models for engaging with communities, and I love that Mark preceded me with an example of exactly this sort of work. So Ireland's not the only place that's doing this, but they do have documented it extremely well, what they're doing. So the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, yes, there's a whole department for that, provided these resources, what you can do in your community. So they provide some models for action and facilitation. They talk about a just transition, public outreach, community action, energy production within the community and projects, climate science, citizen science, adaptation and resilience. So for just transitions, they talk about communities that will be central to our response. They talk about having those well informed, the citizens empowered to act, and that this is essential. It emphasises, their plans emphasise fairness and equity in the solutions. Public outreach, so they're doing their own research on this. And I'll skip through because time's limited, but they've set up particular ways of communicating within their communities. And so this is at central government level, establishing these in collaboration with local government. So as you can see, even involving people in fairly small actions does get them involved, and that is the point of this. And they've set up these local authority climate action research offices, CAROs, which actually now provide resources and assistance to people at a local level. Citizen science is about having people work within the communities on research, and that can be monitoring change or monitoring the effect of programs. So another Irish source is about innovative methods for actually engaging with people. So that, if you like, that was the how. This is what. The other was what. This is how. In other words. So it's important to understand the diversity, to engage with communities, create networks of activities, techniques, and groups. They talk about valuing the partnerships that we can create, promoting learning from each other, strengthening strategies through the resources that can be provided. The kinds of methodologies that they suggest are, and we don't have time to go into these in detail. If anybody wants to ask more about them, I can actually provide that information, or I can provide the link. But these are essentially psychologically based processes. So what can we encourage psychologists to be doing at a local level? It's important to be visible, not hide behind our qualifications or our feelings that our profession is somehow aloof from this and works at higher levels. We need to be getting involved, participate, actually have a go at making submissions, attending hearings, and provide support for groups. Offer help to your councils. They need information, advice, and research that psychology has in loads. We can be raising issues personally. We can be encouraging and assisting others, so supporting candidates who bring diversity to councils, enabling the voices of women, young people, Indigenous peoples, workers, and those with disabilities. And we can be advocating for fair representative systems. So in New Zealand, we have single transferable voting as an electoral option at local body level, but councils get to decide. It's a bit like asking a turkey if it's in favour of Christmas. No, they stick with first past the post because that favours the status quo. Chapman, Trott, and others in the Clayton publication have identified a number of areas where we can be engaging in research. And so, these are research areas that are very relevant to community resilience and community engagement. And she talks about the importance of understanding that these things need to be collective and interdisciplinary. Inviting psychologists to join or form a climate psychology group and be more involved in community action plans, as we are doing in New Zealand. Recognising the value of the role of local government in climate action, real climate action, support it, facilitate it, encourage people to be more involved in research, information distribution, writing, networking, and collaborating with others. And remember at all times that action fosters hope. So that's for ourselves, our members, and for our citizens. I'll close with this. This is a whakatauki, which is a Maori proverb. And I showed this at Lisbon 2 years ago, almost to the day, I guess. And it's about being able to work together. So paddling together, our boat will reach the shore. And so that's my contact details. If anybody wishes to contact me, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you as well to Mark. I hope you'll both come on screen with me here, along with our panelists, who are Dr. Richard Plenny of This Is Consulting, Dr. Frank Worrell, who is the incoming APA president, and Dr. Hana Suzuki, who represents the Japanese Psychological Association in the Global Psychology Alliance. Thank you all so much for being here. So I'm going to put a question out there to our panelists that relates to Mark and Brian's presentations, just as an initial kind of point of discussion for related to the information you just presented, and of course kind of what bounces around it in I guess I would say psychologists who's in their kind of daily routine of things. So they were fascinating and brilliant presentations. Again, thank you both. I guess I'm curious, and we'll go ahead and start with Frank, then Hana, and wrap up with Richard. Just brief responses on how you see the ideas that Mark and Brian brought to the discussion of ways in which we can address the climate crisis, complementing one another or potentially competing with one another, and how you might see psychology very specifically involved in their efforts. So Frank, go ahead.
Thank you for the invitation to participate. And thank you, Mark and Brian, for those presentations. I would say a couple things. I think that with regard to the complementing each other, I think we all recognize that, in fact, psychology, a lot of, as was pointed out, involves engagement, participation, relationships. And so that actually, in fact, is a really important aspect of what psychologists do, whether they're, looking at associations or working with people in therapy. And so one of the things I think that as psychologists we need to do is actually we need to get our departments involved, because, Susan Clayton is an environmental psychologist. Brian is an environmental psychologist. How many environmental psychology classes do we have in undergraduate programs, even though psychology is the most popular major, right? For example. And then how do we get, in fact, environmental psychology, not just in undergraduate or university settings, but in K-12 as well, right? How do we get people thinking those ways? In terms of competition, I think one of the things that we will face is that the nature of the academy, right, fighting for scarce resources, for grants, funding, and so forth, is in fact me getting a grant in environmental psychology, taking away from somebody who's a social psychologist to the developmental psychologist, who in fact is not particularly interested in climate change as their research agenda. How do we decide to work together so that, in fact, because this is an existential threat that's going to affect all of us? And I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Frank. Go ahead, Hannah.
Hi, thank you for inviting me here, and thank you, Mark and Brian, for your wonderful presentation. Now that Frank said that how we gave a thought on what we can do, I just wanted to ask Mark and Brian one question, because I think that we know that we are facing climate crisis. Really doesn't know where to start. And, so I think it would be helpful to know concrete example or specific example to people or company. Hold on, let me rephrase that again. So what can psychologists can do to work with company or people, specific example, what information would be helpful regarding psychology or human factors?
Yeah, that's a great, so your question is for kind of the average CEO, because Mark isn't the average CEO, right? What is it? He's sort of like the dream CEO. So if you run into the average CEO who's kind of like a middle ground at best, maybe not really interested, right? Because there's a bottom line issue, there's a profit issue, there's a board issue. How much interest would they have in having a discussion with psychologists? How much value would they see in what psychological science can contribute? Does anyone on the panel have thoughts on that? Or Brian, go ahead. It seems like we may have lost Mark.
Yeah, I can comment on that. So I think there are a number of things there, Hannah. One is about telling people what we do, and what we can do and what we can offer them. And in response to Amanda, the bottom lines now are not just about profit and profitability. And a lot of our corporations are now actually driven by public appeal. And the public can actually make a difference in terms of what they demand. In New Zealand, there have been long campaigns about removing plastic bags from supermarkets. And they were, reasonably effective now and again, but it wasn't until government came along and said, well, we'll provide you incentives for dropping this because the public pressure is so strong. And so they actually helped supermarkets, but then supermarkets were actually advertising, competing with each other to actually be environmentally responsible. So I think there's sort of a two-edged thing there, one or three-edged in a way, knowing what we can help with, knowing what they want to achieve in terms of being more popular with people, and people putting pressure on.
I have a view as well, and my view is as a psychologist, but as a psychologist who's never worked in a university. I've always worked. I'm representative of those psychologists who've actually had to earn a living by working with people like Mark. In fact, so my sense, I think Brian said it very well, didn't he? He said, people who work in organizations and businesses, I'm trying to find the exact words, they're people too. I think you said something along those lines. They have children and grandchildren. They're concerned about the future. And they also are responsive to changes in pressure and the way the public feels about things. I mean, I can't think of, the business, people want to be in businesses which are going in a direction which is positive. And, at COP26, it was obvious that, those people in the fossil fuel industries were really, that's not where the money is going to be made, where the interest in, where the kudos is. It's in new areas and in developing areas where the excitement is, and where I think that there will be movement. So I don't believe that a lot of CEOs will. I'm not so pessimistic about it as you are. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in green thinking, and green thinking from organizations, from entrepreneurs, from others. And I think that the market, as it were, will pick up for psychologists to help them. Where will they help them? I mean, Frank said it very well. Psychologists have been involved in areas of interaction and involvement with engagement, with collaboration, partnership, those kind of things. I think there's going to be demand for really professional expertise in those areas. I think, generally speaking, and there were a couple of comments I noted, there's going to be a need to explain to the public anyway and involve people in this process. The danger of the ratepayers' revolt and the backlash against things, I think, is very important. People don't necessarily like windmills to be put near their houses. So we're going to have to find ways of making sure that people get engaged, that there's real collaboration and partnerships. And leadership was something, I think, which also both Mark and Brian not only talked about, but demonstrated. This is going to not be sitting on the fence stuff. This is going to need action at a variety of levels. We all need to get involved in our own ways. We need to make a difference. And it's not sitting around, it's actually trying to find ways of doing that. It's going to be in many different ways, in many different levels, but this is such a massive transformation that really is going to demand people at every level to get involved in all sorts of ways. And I think that, the good thing, or most important thing, is we continue to encourage dialogue and conversation between us, and the spirit of working together with this vision in mind. So I feel quite positive about it, actually, although I know the results from COP26 at the moment haven't delivered. I actually feel in the long run, the will is there and things will start to happen.
Thank you all. I might go ahead and share a question from the chat. Then we can similarly, each of you can take a moment to share your thoughts on this. I'm going to add a little bit to this. So the question is, how can environmental psychology be promoted in developing countries, especially where there's a pandemic, and critical issues of things like garbage disposal from medical waste is more pronounced than ever, while we're seeing basically piles of face shields, face masks, PPE, etc. Additionally, that psychologists are so much more focused on addressing mental health conditions of individuals from various sectors, notably as a result of the pandemic. So how, I guess, not only in developing countries, because as Frank noted, Richard and Hannah, like even in countries with relatively high socioeconomic status, the idea of psychology being part of the climate solution outside of people experiencing anxiety associated with psychology or trauma associated with climate disasters is still a bit tenuous. So how can we promote this? How are we going to make that connection for psychologists, not just for our communities? We'll start with Frank, Hannah, and then Richard.
I think it's an interesting question. I do think that's one of, I think we need to, that's why I made the point about departments and stuff, right? Because we know that the data tell us that young people, right, not just young adults, but in fact, adolescents, in fact, are much more concerned about climate change than in fact many of the people who are the generation who are the politicians and so forth. And so engaging those individuals, in fact, you know, as Richard was talking about, people and Brian about neighborhoods and communities, right? Greta Thunberg is her name, I believe, who's become the global sensation, but in fact, who represents a generation of people who are very concerned. And engaging those individuals, I think, in fact, are going to help engage their parents and, in fact, their teachers and communities. And I think that that's one way that psychology can have an impact.
Thank you, Frank. Hannah?
Well, that question made me think that sometimes like we have to be urged to take actions, like the pandemic, COVID pandemic really urged psychologists take action on mental health. And before that, we knew that, you know, the mental health issue was very important, but like it was difficult to raise awareness among people. And the situation actually raised awareness. So that in that sense that, you know, it's too late when we face there that like the climate crisis will raise the issue. So that I think in that sense that we can use that example that like how it could affect our mental health as well, that if mental health issues are very closer, much closer to psychologists, then, you know, many of the psychologists who are in that field can use their expertise to raise awareness about climate crisis among people, among companies, how that might affect their employees. And so that's where I am right now.
Hannah, thank you. Richard, wrapping up for us.
And just like, I think the answer is with young people. I don't know whether you can see this here. It's a picture of a bag that I took into COP26. And that is a dinosaur from my 5-year-old grandson that I looked at every day. They are talking about climate. They're talking about climate change. They're aware of all these things. And I took that there just to remind me every day that this is about future generations, and that if we don't take action now, we'll go the way of the dinosaurs. So it's, you know, it's really simple. I think it's to do with young people. Just Mark, when we saw Mark at COP26, he had with him a young person from one of the citizens' assemblies who was speaking and working and talking with the ministers for Austria and for Ireland, and speaking very eloquently about what it meant to her. And she carried great moral authority. And I think it's the young who will change the attitudes of people, and it's the young we will listen to, and it's the young we need to educate.
Wow. Every time I talk to you all, honestly, you just, I thank you. You're inspiring and, you know, brilliant. And I think you have great ideas and really good points. So the Alliance needs to make a list of kind of the mandate here. And many of you are actually part of the Alliance. So prepare yourselves for a lot of work to do. But thank you so much. And with that, we'll take a 5-minute break and be back. And we have the distinct honor of talking with Rosamira Guyen, who is the director of Proyecto Titi in Colombia, a grassroots community project. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. And again, thank you all. Richard, Hannah, Frank, Brian, and Mark. See you in 5.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome back. It is an honor and a delight to introduce Rosamira, I apologize, Rosamira Gudin, who is
Yes.
the executive director, gosh, all of a sudden, executive director of Proyecto Titi in Colombia. And she's going to speak to us about motivating community action to protect cotton top tamarins in Colombia. Thank you for being here, Rosamira. We look forward to your presentation.
Amanda, it's a pleasure for me to be connecting with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me and for participating in this event. And for us, it will be interesting to share our conservation work and trying to find links to the topic of this gathering. Because of our big social component of our conservation work, I think there's a few interesting learned lessons more than anything that would be great to share with you today. So thank you so much. I will start by telling you a little more about what we do, and then how we can find connections to encouraging communities to take action for a climate change. So I will share my presentation with you. Hold on a second, please. Okay. All right. And I believe you can see my screen now.
Yes.
And
yes.
This is the little cotton top tamarin, the little monkey about the size of a squirrel. We'll be talking about them today. And they live in this amazing forest that it's found in northern Colombia. It's a tropical dry forest, and even though there's quite a size difference with us humans, they're actually quite similar in their social behavior. They live in family groups just like we do. Babies learn everything from their parents as well as we do. When the babies become juveniles, they either get kicked out of the house, like it happens with us, or they leave the house to find a mate, a partner, and find their own home. They are very, very territorial, just like we are humans. And they have a very sophisticated communication system, just like us, with chirps and of different pitches. And they communicate alarm, grooming, being hungry, being in danger, and all that. Not that we're biased or anything, but it's a beautiful, amazing little monkey, very cute. But there's a couple of things about this little primate and that make it very special, especially for us Colombians. And one thing is that it's only found in that little red dot within our whole planet. You don't find cotton top tamarins anywhere else in the world, in the wild, and not even in the whole country. You see the small insert of Colombia in this map, and only in the black spot, in northern Colombia is the only place on earth where you will see cotton top tamarins. So again, that makes it very special, especially for all us Colombians. But besides being just a very unique species, it is facing, as many other wildlife all around the planet, many challenges related to habitat loss, mostly for cattle ranching, agriculture, for selective logging, for domestic uses by local communities. And also, it's a second threat is being captured for the pet trade. It is such a little animal. You see them in the shoulder of this guy, and they get hunted to be sold on the illegal pet trade. And that is certainly impacting their wild populations. These two threats have put cotton tops in a very unwanted category of critically endangered, which is basically one step away from being extinct in the wild. We estimate there's about 7,000 cotton top tamarins left in the wild in Colombia, but that number on its own may not say much. What is really shocking is the amount of forest that is left, and which is less than 8%, and not all of it is viable forest for the monkeys, or not all of it has the resources that monkeys need to survive. So they are really, or they have been really endangered. And that is the focus of the work that I lead here in Colombia of Proyecto Tití. It's a nonprofit organization that is solely focused on securing a long-term future for cotton-top tamarins. And we do this with 4 lines of actions that we call pillars that you see in this slide, that it's focused on field research, which is actually how the project started 30 years ago by Dr. Ann Savage, who came from the United States to study the monkeys in the wild and just fell in love with the country, with the monkeys, with the people, and she founded Proyecto Tití. So field research, which has taught us a lot of what we know about cotton tops. Then, of course, being forest destruction or habitat loss the main threat, then we're focusing a lot of our efforts in protecting, restoring, and connecting the forest for cotton-top tamarins. And then the other 2 pillars are what connects us with the event today, which is the social component of our work, focused on environmental education and also community, generating community income alternatives to reduce the use and exploitation, unsustainable exploitation of forest resources for subsistence. And this is where the areas where we work, you see those green dots, it's basically what's left of forest for cotton-top tamarins in Northern Colombia. So you see how dramatic the situation is, with just fragments of forest scattered within the landscape. And we're focusing on areas that have been protected regionally or nationwide, and trying to expand and work around the communities that live very close to these forests that still have cotton-top tamarins and that are still protectable for that matter. And of course, in the long term, expand those forested areas and connect them in between. So I'll tell you a little bit of the work we do on each of those pillars, just to put you into context, and then I'll focus a little more on the social side of our work. We've been using telemetry, which is a little transmitter that the daddy of the family group carries, like you see in this picture. And that sends out a signal that helps us find the animals in the wild. It's a 1-pound monkey, so it lives in a lush green forest when it's rainy, right? And is very elusive, and usually hangs out 30 to 40 feet above the ground. So it's not that easy to see them, but that helps us find them and establish study groups that have taught us a lot about behavior, diet, reproduction, and all sorts of information that we have used for creating strategies to protect the species and to restore the forest where they live. As part of our research work, we have also done population surveys that help us assess the conservation status of the species, and that is how we have that 7,000 number. We have done 2 censuses, and we're actually studying the 3rd census after 10 years to assess the impact of our conservation work and the current conservation status of the monkeys, to continue our mission, expanding our mission into the next few years. The second pillar is, of course, protecting forests. We have worked with environmental communities to protect whatever's left. So those little green fragments that you saw on the map, we are working very hard to secure those. And then with that, also create our own forest reserves that can help us expand those protected areas or connect areas that are isolated. Cotton-top tamarins always hang out up in the trees. They never come down to the ground. So when you have isolated forest patches, that creates a problem for the species, and they never come down to the ground because they become vulnerable to predators, which are usually boa snakes or small mammals or raptor birds. So it is very important that we work in connecting whatever fragments of forest are left. And that is why we are creating in the areas where we work, we're creating like spider webs of forest corridors. And we do this by working with local communities, creating conservation agreements and outlining within that agreement the areas that they will assign for forest growth, and that then we come and restore to be able to create that connectivity that the monkeys, not only the monkeys need, many other wildlife species around cattle pastures and agricultural fields that are the high tradition in Northern Colombia, and that basically are the reason why deforestation is so extensive. So we work with the farmers, we propagate saplings of native trees, which is actually some other way we have applied all the knowledge we have acquired studying the monkeys, is we know what they eat. So we plant trees that in the future will provide food and shelter for cotton-top tamarins. And we do this with the farmers so that they get involved within their land and within the protected areas to help plant these saplings that we grow in our nursery, and then monitor their growth over time. And then, of course, make sure that we document everything to be able to track how fast the forest grows, survival rates, growth rates, and the overall impact of the forest restoration work. This is basically what we want. We want the monkeys to be able to move around and find their resources, and then, of course, have continuity within the landscape, which is also very good for protecting water sources and forest resources. And we talk about cotton-top tamarins because it's the focus of our work, but while protecting the forest for the monkeys, we are protecting the forest for many other species that are part of the Colombian biodiversity, specifically from the tropical dry forest in the North region. So we're actually helping to protect a whole ecosystem that it's much more than just the monkeys. The monkeys end up being just a symbol of a whole ecosystem that needs very much our care and protection. And that is not only for the animals, but this is where we have used our social skills and the connection of the needs of people with the landscape and the forest that are impacted by climate change. You know, forests are good for people, especially in resources like water. And that in this region of Colombia is critical because we go through a 6-month period with no rain at all. And then farmers struggle very much for water. And they have started to learn that by protecting these corridors and these pieces of forest, you know, the water sources stay longer during the dry season, and they can access resources for their farm animals or their crops. So this is where we connect our conservation work with the people and the local communities to generate and encourage action to protect the forest, and then somehow contribute to the issue of climate change. So what we have done in our community programs is basically make our conservation message relevant to people and to their interests. And I think that's what has been the key of approaching communities. And it wasn't like that in the beginning. We have learned that along the way. So this is one of our programs that is called the Eco Mochilas, and these are tote bags made with recycled plastic bags. You know, plastic is a huge problem all over the world. And we collect these plastic bags on the source before they reach, you know, waterways or forests or dumpsters. And we use them for crocheting these beautiful handbags that the females can do in their homes while they care for their families and generate an income for their you know, better livelihood. They have been doing this this project is over 15 years old, and recently they were able to source their work to local fashion designers that are using them in the runway or in fashion stores, combining plastic bags with different with other materials like you know, acrylic and threads and natural fibers. This has allowed them to generate a small economy that helps their families and therefore connects them with the benefit of protecting a species. So if you stay away from the forest basically and have an income that is on top of that made with recycled material that pollutes our environment, then it's just a benefit all over, you know, on all parts. We also have a group of women that make these beautiful plush toys that, send the message of, if you want a cotton top tamarin, instead of having one as a pet, please buy one of these. You help these women that are making a sustainable living, and then you convey a message that cotton tops are not pets. And then what I mentioned before is another way, we traditionally have engaged females, but we learned about the importance of working with the male community because those are the ones that hunt the animals and cut the trees. So we are involving farmers in our forest restoration work with the purpose of the conservation agreements providing support to increase their productivity, and they commit to saving these corridors of forest that help us connect and protect water sources and the forest resources. They participate in many different ways by transporting the saplings from the nursery to the planting areas, and also to planting them and monitoring them. And most recently, which is been suspended by COVID, but we hope to resume, is to engage community also in ecotourism opportunities. Being cotton tops such a unique species, and having the opportunity to come and see them in the wild is very unique. So that has helping us increase the value of also of cotton tops for the local communities. And finally, our education work, which is focused on also with the same purpose, making it relevant to kids, and understand that cotton tops are not to be pets in our homes. So we touch on what's relevant to them, such as family, being with your family, being with mom and dad through puppet shows. This is our pre and post evaluation show a significant increase in knowledge and understanding of kids about why cotton tops should not be in our homes. We do have a program that teach them how to train their dogs so that they find more value in having a domestic animal instead of a wild animal as a pet. And then secondary school kids go through the 1 semester program that takes them into the forest to see the cotton top tamarins. And for them, it's more a sense of ownership, understanding that this is only found here in Colombia. And it's a sense of action at a young age to encourage leadership on, okay, I can make a difference. I can tell people about this. I can help plant trees. I can not have cotton tops as pets, and become active in protecting the forest and understanding how important it is for us to protect these forest areas, and making it fun, of course, for them to go into the forest, have a day. A lot of these kids live in these communities and have never been to the forest. And some of them have been to hunt animals or birds or something. So we really want to shake that and motivate action by things that, things that they can do on their own, and that they can understand that are important to them. Just become leaders and become communicators of a message through puppet shows, through artwork, and through sharing this with their families. This is also results of a pre and post evaluations of our conservation or education work with these communities, and how they increase the knowledge and then change attitudes, and we're in the process of tracking changing behavior, which is the sole intent of our programs. And in that process, we identify leaders like Rosa, who went through all of our programs and now is one of our teachers, and Nelson, who recently, got awarded a Disney Conservation Hero Award, for 10 years of environmental young leadership, working around different parts in Colombia and spreading the word about cotton top tamarins and wildlife conservation. Or the story of our friend Hector Barrios, who found a little baby cotton top that had fallen from a tree in his property, and instead of keeping it as a pet, he called us because of it's a commitment from his conservation agreement, and we were able to return this little baby to her family in the forest. And that is the type of impact where we are looking for, is making conservation, increase the value of conservation, making it relevant to your needs as an adult, as a kid, as a female in a local community, and then understanding that this got a benefit for you, and it solves a problem you have, and then you're motivated to do something about it. So it's encouraging the action, but also understanding benefits. Of course, after you have been able to solve your basic needs, such as food, education, and health for your family. And we celebrate Cotton Top Tamarind Day. Of course, this is pre-COVID. We're hoping to next year come back to this, and just making fun and relevant. We have found that in order to encourage action for climate change and for forest conservation and wildlife conservation, it needs to be relevant to the different audiences, and it needs to empower the locals to understand that to their scale and to their level, they can make a difference. This is our social media in case you want to learn more about our work. And I want to acknowledge our team, working with us here in Colombia to protect cotton top tamarinds. Thank you very much.
Rosa Mira, thank you so much. With that, I'll quickly introduce our discussion panelists. They are Dr. Catriona Davis McCabe, who is a GPA representative from the Australian Psychological Society. Hello.
Hello.
Terry Morrissey from This Is Consulting. Hi, Terry.
Hi.
And Roberto Ordóñez González, doctor, I should have said, who is the president of the Nicaraguan Psychological Association. Roberto, it's great having you. Just to note, Roberto will be speaking in Spanish. And so if you'd like an English translation of that, you'll just change your settings on your screen where the little like globe is, or the circle that either indicates English or Spanish or Portuguese. So I wanted to put it out there. We'll start with Catriona, then Terry, and then Roberto. That was really compelling. I feel like I have lots of questions for the panelists, but maybe just to start with their reflections on ways in which psychology is highlighted in the work that Proyecto Titi is doing, even if it may not be framed as psychology, quote unquote. Catriona?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thank you, Rosa Mira. What an absolutely fantastic presentation. It made me think about just how diverse the effects of climate change are. And just when you talked about the impact on wildlife, on the loss of forests, that reminds me of 2019, 2020 in Australia, where we had unusually intense bushfires. And locally, this was known as the Black Summer. But we also found that was followed by widespread flooding and cyclones. And all of this was while we were also dealing with the pandemic. And I think these effects take an enormous toll on mental health and well-being of communities, but also on the wildlife and the animals. For us in particular, the rural and remote and farming communities were affected. And I was just reflecting on what we did at that time. And then we reacted. We had to react to the disaster. So we provided training, we set up networks. But as you were talking, I was thinking, we need more than reaction. We've got to be proactive. And that's what really came across to me as to what you're doing. So as a profession, as psychologists, we are responsible for understanding climate change and for promoting behavior change. And that's grassroots. That starts with exactly what you're doing.
Yes, should I comment on, can I comment on that? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Catriona. Yes, you're right. And actually, part of that semester education program that we do with the seventh grade students has 10 units. And a couple of these units talk about how the consequences of not caring for the forest, and that includes flooding, forest fires, and the impact that can have on the community. So if you don't care about the environment or climate change, when it touches your family and your patrimony, then it's gonna affect you. So you try to instill a sense of responsibility, but also action, preventive action. Okay, so if I protect this little piece of forest and I farm on this piece of land, I'm helping to avoid landslides or flooding. and then I can, live in harmony with my surroundings. And we encourage that quite a bit. In the same with the traffic of cotton tops, is like we need to, there's a lot of action that authorities need to take to prevent the traffic or to control the traffic or penalize the traffic. But what we want is to create conscious citizens in these young individuals that understand that it is just not right, and the consequences of that, because most of the times they do this without having no idea. They think, oh, I have a dog, I can have a monkey, I can have a snake. No, you cannot. You should not. So, but understanding why makes a huge difference. And that is why it's the intensity of these education programs over a semester and our evaluation pre and post to make sure they understand. And then increasing knowledge is the first step. But we want them to change those attitudes, and then after that, change behavior. So that is a bigger challenge, but that's what we're aiming to. So thank you for that. Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming for.
Yeah, and that research is so important, isn't it? Because we're able, that's the role of psychology. We can develop and evaluate pro-environmental campaigns and programs. So fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, if I can come in next, Amanda, if that's okay. I think it's a very, thank you very much, Rosamira. I haven't heard about this project before tonight, so it's been very informative and very educational. But I think the thing for me which is interesting is the parallels between what you're doing and what's happening in different parts of the world. And one of the things that is important is how do you get communities to become aware of the impact they're having on the environment and the educational process that's happening there. And I think what you've done there is connecting in the issue of a sort of a threatened species and connecting it back into the people who are working in that environment. And one of the things that struck me was about how you can say to people how they can make a difference. But by making a difference, I think you start with what matters to them, and maybe substituting some of the things that matter to them. For example, the issue of having a pet. And I was very taken by the fact that you can substitute the traditional pet that you were used to with a different type of a pet. And we do that a lot in sort of psychological work, and where we for example, habit formation and getting people to change habits, where we get them to substitute, maybe it could be a form of addiction, for example. We get them to substitute one kind of form of addiction, maybe for another, but to actually use something that's much more beneficial to the individual rather than harmful to the individual. So that's one particular analogy I could see in what you were doing. I think the second thing is that the really important role of climate literacy and the educational way in which these things can make a difference, and how you go about doing that. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you got communities involved, how you got individuals involved, because you started out working with non-humans and ended up working quite a lot with humans. And what was the transition how you made that transition? I mean, something may have sparked that or got you thinking about that. And I'd very much like to hear from your perspective what that was.
Yes, Terry, thank you so much. Yes, well, when we realized, we started this as a field research project, just understand the monkeys, understand the species of such a very unique species. But then when you start understanding the threats that this species was facing, then you realize that it's all about humans impacting the forest and the monkeys, both things, right? And then, of course, you want to stop the threats as a conservation organization or reduce them. And that's how you find ways to do so. And if communities are hunting animals and cutting trees, then that generated our interest to say, okay, what can we do about this? And then you try to understand and you realize, okay, it's an economic problem. People live in poverty in these rural communities and they don't have jobs, they don't have health, they don't have education. Okay, let's try to generate some alternatives so that they can get that income from a different source and then stay away from the forest. And in the process, understand their needs. And at the beginning, actually the Ecomochila program, the handbags, we came with this idea to them, but then we soon learned that for future projects, we needed to build on their preferences, on their skills, on their whatever was important and relevant to them. And I think that's over time, we found ways to communicate, because climate change is such an abstract issue, even for us that move around the planet or have a more global vision of the problem or study it. But for a local community that is struggling to survive, it's like, I don't understand that. And I don't care. I just need to find food for my family, and that's, I need to survive. And it's day-to-day thing. So it is a huge process to find, it is a challenge to find what connects them. So for the women, they got interested because they really want to celebrate their kids' birthdays. They want to buy supplies for their schools every year. They want to send them to school with uniforms. And this was a great opportunity to do something at home, caring for them, and being able to generate an income for them. And then with farmers, what is relevant to them? To them is their crops, their productivity, water through the dry season. So, we just approach them. It's like, do you know that if you save this little piece of forest, you're going to have better chances to keep water and conserve water for your dry season? And that's like, yeah, I'll go for that. So if you talk about climate change and all of these things that are too abstract for them, they're not going to understand. So you need to find a speech and a way to communicate that is relevant to them. And when you find that connection, people say, okay, yes, I can do it. I don't care that much about the monkeys, but I do care about water. So I'll protect this little piece of forest. Yeah, it helps the monkeys, but it helps me and my family and my farm animals to have water during the dry season. I think that has been one of the most important learned lessons from our end, and that we continue to build on that and provide feedback to be more effective when we approach new communities or different audiences. Even, with the kids, it's a different thing. They want to have fun. They want to do something fun, different. Let's take them to the forest and see the monkeys. And let's tell them that this is the only place on the world that you see the monkeys. And they generate a sense of belonging and a sense of, wow, we are cool because we are the only ones that have this cool little monkey. And finding those connections, I think it's key. And just making sure that the scale, even though you're working to solve a larger problem, you get easily overwhelmed if you say, I cannot do anything. I mean, I cannot change this worldwide, but I can in my little community here and make a difference. So making sure that you understand that you can make a difference there, and that adds to many other efforts around the planet, then you feel like you can do something about it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Those are great points. Roberto, would you, sorry, I can't see you, but I would love to know, me encantaría saber cuáles.
I would love to know what your opinions are about this issue. Very good afternoon.
Ponencia de
About
la señora Rosamira.
Rosamira's talk. What is your opinion? Well, good afternoon, good day, good evening. Can you hear me?
Bueno, me encantó, Rosamira.
Well, Rosamira, I really loved your presentation. What an excellent presentation. A study or report that National Geographic made in July of 2019 showed the importance of the interaction that human beings have with nature to improve mental health. And when I was looking at that forest and when I was seeing your actions, I immediately saw the results of this amount of scientific work and that was done by National Geographic about what you were precisely argumenting. But I really liked how you supported these communities, these impoverished communities, despite being surrounded by so much wealth. These were impoverished communities with making the use of recyclable material, reusable material in order to generate economic well-being. And logically, that's going to help mental health as well. As the pyramid of Maslow shows us, firstly, we have to guarantee our survival, and then we continue to advance with other important elements, such as having an interest for the world. If I'm hungry, I'm not going to be interested about the world. If my child is hungry and crying, I'm not going to care about the world. So that fit, I thought that was beautiful. However, I'm still worried about something important here, and a reflection perhaps that you can give us. How is this project at a local level in Colombia? How can it, well, we have lessons learned from you, obviously, but how can it take a leap and impact public policies, the policies of our governments and the policies of our citizens? Because we speak about a zone, we speak about actions. And being in Central America, for example, there are many NGOs, many institutions that are working with the environment, and they're working with excellent results. In Nicaragua, for example, we work in preserving a forest called Indio Maíz Forest, which is a reserve area that has protected us from even hurricanes. And Central America, as Amanda told me earlier, is simply 34% or 0.04, not even one, not 0.5, 0.34% of greenhouse emissions at a global level. That's all Central America, not even half of 1%. However, Central America, 4 of our countries are among the countries that are the most affected by climate change provoked by man. Today, the 18th of November, Nicaragua is 1 year after the impact of Hurricane Iota, Category 5 hurricane in a Caribbean coast that left 21 deaths and thousands and billions of dollars in losses. Despite working in our forest, despite supporting our communities, apart from that, what would be the step so that these initiatives with excellent results, nonetheless, can actually take a leap so that our governments, our institutions actually can do something at a government level?
Should I do Spanish or English, Amanda?
Como tú prefieras.
Okay.
As you wish. Roberto, this is a question that is very difficult to answer. And I think that this is something that every NGO organization would wish to have access to political spaces in our countries. I'm sure you may know, and I'm sure you understand how difficult it is, because linking to a political side from the work that you're doing with all the challenges that are associated to the policies that are in place in our countries, full of controversies and corruption, really. And that is a huge difficulty. But at one moment when I was going around, I had access and I had contact with certain people that were working on issues related to valuing natural resources and adding an actual monetary value to natural resources, trying to calculate the actual value of a square foot of forest. And I always was thinking about that, and I always had that concern and that question, that it was a way to communicate, which is very important, to communicate with maybe the different directors or with leaders or politicians in the country. Unfortunately, this is not a very easy issue. It requires lots of expertise. It requires the discipline of economics and environmental economics, for that matter. But I've always thought that that would be a way to communicate. We talked about communicating with relevant issues with different publics and different audiences. In my concept, the relevant issue for authorities or politicians in our country is precisely that, the economic aspect. If we had the actual ability or the skills or a partnership with certain entities that can tell you, look, how much is a TT actually worth? A TT, white-headed TT worth? Why is a white-headed TT more important in the forest than in somebody's home, or maybe being extinct? And that actually in dollars and cents and millions of dollars versus cattle farming in a forest, what costs more? What gives you better returns? So doing these calculations is extremely difficult. I've gone through different conferences and different courses that talk about this, but I believe that it would be the most relevant way to actually touch authorities. Say, this costs such and such money if it exists or if it doesn't exist. And this is the impact that it is generating. And this is the impact that the deaths, for example, that you were speaking about are going to cause, the material damages in communities. This is the cost and what it costs to rebuild. Unfortunately speaking, sometimes we, with that skepticism that we have in our Latin American countries with politicians and politics. We know that many people make profits in the midst of corruption with the rebuilding of these natural disasters. And that's why perhaps there's not a big interest to avoid these natural disasters. But I think that it's a way to reach certain politicians. If we had maybe advisors or a way to communicate with monetary, economic terms, it would be way more effective than the focus that we do with a child, for example, where you want to touch his heart or her heart, where you want to touch their affective side, or maybe a campesino or a farmer in terms of their harvest. But I believe that that would be the most efficient way to touch these people. And maybe in the future, or hopefully in the nearby future, we can, from the TT project in Colombia, have certain influence on these decisions. And obviously, our model is a completely replicatable model for other species in other contexts. We can replicate this, and this has always been one of our intentions, to share these scenarios, to share our work in these types of scenarios. And we're always open to sharing information, the results from our assessments, our evaluation, focuses, lessons learned, so that others can benefit from these experiences. Thank you very much. Excellent answer. And that's the reflection. These small little pushes throughout the world, these community actions, these ecological actions, being able to take them to decision makers at a national and global level, which is what we really need. Sometimes we do local actions, I repeat, that have very good results. But if they're not elevated to other communities, we still suffer the climate change consequences provoked by man. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. These have been brilliant questions and phenomenal discussion. Thank you all. I'm going to try and kind of integrate a couple of questions in the chat, which get to that, the kind of like the way this discussion has been moving. And the question effectively is, what would the implications be of taking a model like this? Something that came up at COP quite a bit was, okay, so we need a shared outcome, which is, reduction in emissions. We need less pollution, less trash, so each of us can decide in our own country, community context, how we're going to achieve those goals. We have shared metrics, but different ways of achieving those. What kinds of implication? We have someone here from Australia, Ireland, and Nicaragua. What would it look like to try to work in the way you're working, Rosamira, in perhaps each of the three countries from which our panelists hail? And similarly, if each of the three of you have thoughts on that, it would be fabulous to learn more.
Okay, do you want me? I can start if you like, Amanda.
Okay, sure. So we'll go Terry, Catriona, Roberto, and then of course Rosamira.
Yeah, I mean, coming from Ireland, as Mark Foley said, we sometimes punch way above our weight in the impact we can have. In the Irish context, I think the area that we need to do a lot more work on is agriculture. And I think the trying to educate farmers on the impact that they're having on the environment. And certainly, the one of the things that was positive coming out of COP26 for me was the commitment to reduce methane gases. And I think that that's a very direct link to the farming community. And I think, taking a leaf from Rosamira's work, I think we have to start from where they're at. You sort of start from where people are at and try and link what they're doing back to the consequences of what they're doing, and look for alternative substitutes for the work that they're doing. And I think that's probably a longer term project, but I think that's something where we can certainly take some guidance there from what Rosamira was doing, in how we get a big lobby group. And I hear what you're saying about the role of lobby groups and advocacy groups. And they have the ear of government, and I think it's trying to have another voice and alternative voices to say, there are things that are very damaging. We need to look at that. So I would see looking at the whole agricultural sector in the Irish context.
Great point, Terry. Catriona?
Yeah, I think that we would need to look more at community engagement to get people on board. And I suppose education is the key thing here. We need effective education for children and for adults. And when Rosamira was talking, you were able to engage the children. That made a lot of sense to me. And when we did some research here around young people and climate change, and I know people have talked about that earlier, but actually 4 out of 5 young people were anxious about climate change. But 3 out of 4 didn't feel that their opinions counted or that anybody was listening to them. So I think that's where we would need to start, with the community and with that engagement.
That's a great point. Thank you. Roberto.
Sí, bueno,
Yes.
creo que
Well, I believe that it's very important. How can psychologists influence psychoeducational aspects with children, teenagers, boys and girls? This TT project in Colombia, TT Monkeys, where they're educating children in order to preserve the environment, to protect the wildlife and the plant life, and take the domestic animals that are truly the ones that are the adequate animals to become pets. I think that's very important for this substitution, and see how psychologists in our countries, how we can create strategies, psychoeducational strategies for children in our communities, but also for the community members that are adults as well, that can take from those natural resources from the forest and to guarantee their subsistence. So we need to think and we need to analyze, how can psychologists and how can psychology provide and promote psychoeducational tools to build awareness for children and adults on community issues.
Excellent points. Rosamira, have you thought about, or taking all this into consideration and the significant differences, I guess, when we look at Australia, Ireland, Nicaragua, what it would mean to adapt the work you're doing to a different setting?
Yes, I think I see the common thread in the learned lessons that we have accumulated apply. I think it's just human nature. It's all human nature in all different parts of the world, and we behave somehow alike. And something that I think is very important is what's important to you, and the sense of you being able to do something about it within the world you control or you move around, and that to me is critical, because even a few years back, I heard about a concept of ecophobia, when you kind of like were telling the kids the world is going to end, the environment is, you're going to live on a very damaged world. That provides anxiety. Of course it provides this, people, I don't want to know about it. This is your fault. I cannot take responsibility for that. But instead of that, you get them excited about this, this something you can do. You can plant a tree, care for it, and give a great shadow when you're, when you can sit down under that tree and enjoy and see the birds come and eat the fruits of this tree. I mean, those things you can do all over. It's just the concept of engaging people with your immediate context and giving them a sense of ownership, pride, and action that they can make a difference, even if it's just in their backyard. I mean, sometimes we aspire for something big, but it creates it's overwhelming for all of us. So I think in the case of kids, for sure, in the case of adults, it's the same thing. What do you care about? In the case of the agricultures in Ireland, is what is the problem there? Understanding the issue and finding alternatives, but that are relevant to them. If they're, for instance, if using pesticides and they're polluting the water sources that they're drinking, they're going to get sick. So if you find something like that in each of the contexts where you work, I'm sure you will find approaches that will be effective and that will allow you to communicate better and to generate some action, even if it's just the local action. I know this is it's a worldwide problem, but I think we have to act where we can control and make a difference, and be proud of it, and be proud with the results, and don't get discouraged by the scale of your work. because it is making a difference for a lot of people there in this place. And that's replicable. It's human nature again. I think it applies to many different places in the world, most of it.
I feel like you're a psychologist at heart.
I think I'm a learned psychologist, so
Yeah.
out of experience.
Well, it's actually inspiring that kind of like, you know, that as an expert in conservation, that where it's taking you is to kind of like, hey, the conservation piece is going to be even more effective where there's the consideration of the human factors, the psychology piece. So Rosamira, thank you so much. And to the panel as well, really intriguing and just delightful. So everyone gets 9 minutes of break time. And again, thank you all. And we will see you soon.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Welcome back. I know that Dr. Carlin is with us, and I'm sure that her screen will be highlighted momentarily. I'll just take a moment to say thank you. There you are. Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for being here with us. Dr. Carlin is the founder and CEO of the Sea Change Institute, and she's going to talk to us today about applying psychological science to reducing energy use in buildings. Beth, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi there, and thanks everyone for being here at all different times of the day and night. I'm going to go ahead and how long does it take a psychologist to share their screen after business hours in their time zone? Not as long as it could have been. All right. Can somebody chime in if you can't see my slides? Okay. So I'm Beth Carlin. I'm going to talk specifically today about, I'm going to try and focus in on some work I've done specifically looking at energy use in buildings and residential energy use. And really I did that because I think one of the best ways to talk about applying psychology, applying behavioral science in practice is to prove the universal through the specific. So I wanted to just get really specific and give a few concrete examples from the work we've done. But hopefully, regardless of what you're working on, you can see some of the things that I'm talking about and how they're applicable broadly across anything we're doing, applying behavioral science to any pressing social issue, climate, environment, social injustice, and all of the things that are now increasingly and intersectionally affecting us. So I started an organization called Sea Change Institute about 6 years ago after I had completed my doctoral training, as well as a couple small stints in government and in academia, because I really wanted to apply behavioral science in real time to real problems with real partners. And I found that that was a little bit harder to do within a university setting, within academia, but our goal is to be a research institute. We go to conferences, we publish in journals, we try and bring real world, current behavioral science into an applied setting, because I feel like the problems facing us are too serious not to. We can't wait for that traditional loading dock model in which, researchers write journal articles that are applied or translated into newspaper articles that are translated into blogs that are read by consultants that are applied to pressing problems. We wanted to kind of slow that loading dock model. So you can see we work largely in climate change and energy, but not exclusively. We're working right now with the European Union's DG Klima Office. But we're also working with health plans. We work on Medicaid. We work on genocide. We work on media and social change. We've done some work on voter reform in the past couple of years. But again, today I wanted to really hone in on one specific example, talking about some of our work in energy. But first, before I kind of get into the how and some of the projects we do, I always like to start with why. A couple speakers earlier tonight talked about this, like why psychology for climate change? And the answer is there are a lot of behaviors that we can engage in to attenuate, to mitigate our carbon impact, to help us adapt and prepare for our changing climate. But the truth is, we're not always every day, even the absolute best of us. Sometimes our actions often are more like this, right? We're kind of just sitting, we're not rational. We're not always rational people. We can't always do the best, most optimal behavior. In modernity, it's almost impossible to really be a perfect climate actor. And while we like to think of ourselves, a lot of the traditional programs out there are carrot and stick, right? A lot of government relies on regulations and incentives that kind of have this tacit assumption, right? The rational economic theory that all of us act like we're Mr. Spock. We're rational, we're self-optimizing, but the truth is we're a lot more, most of us. This is kind of for any of you, social psychologists, yes, I am reducing dual process theory to Kirk and Spock because this is what I do. I talk mostly to non-psychology audiences. But the truth is most of us are more like Captain Kirk. We're rash, we're brash, and let's be honest, in our best days, we're Kirk. On our worst days, we're more like Homer, just wanting to eat a donut, sit on a couch, right? And so psychology really acknowledges and meets us where we are, meets our Homer selves, and figures out how we can change behavior. So that's kind of my why for psychology and behavioral scientists. We have an important role because we really are talking to and meeting people where they are rather than where we want them to be. So if I've made a case to us as a psychology community and or to others that might or might not think there's a seat at the table for us, then the question is how, right? How can we help? And I think I just love this kind of simple model with 3 parts: developing clear research questions, applying theory, and developing and executing appropriate methods. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give one example from my research work I've done and or we do at SeaChange for each of these. Again, just not trying to be broad, but just an example of each one. So thinking about clear research questions, this is so important. And I think, we often leap towards our ability to collect and analyze data, but really helping, one of the things that I find we do that's so useful when we go into applied setting with a government or a nonprofit partner or a corporate partner is really helping hone in and asking good questions. We were that was drilled into us, right, in graduate school. And so, and to kind of talk about and give us a little clarity on what that might not look like, I've invited my friend, John. Oh, I'm realizing I have to take these out for you to hear my video. See, I knew I was doing something wrong. All right, 1 second. I turn those off. That should work. And then I'm going to put this back on.
For instance, a few years ago, Kellogg's was forced to stop airing this ad.
A clinical study showed kids who had a filling breakfast of Frosted Mini Wheat cereal improved their attentiveness by nearly 20%.
Okay, 2 fun facts there. First, when they say nearly 20%, it's because they're rounding up from 11. Secondly, they were comparing kids who'd eaten cereal with a control group of kids who had no breakfast at all. Not so much a case for mini wheats as it is the concept of food. A much fairer slogan would be Frosted Mini Wheats. They're literally better than nothing.
I love that clip. One, I love almost everything John Oliver does, but I think it makes a great point because what he's kind of making fun of here and what seems so silly is the gold standard, right? It's an RCT. And not to say that there's no place for RCTs, but if we want to do better than nothing, if we want to improve, and usually when people come to us, they're saying, how do we optimize? How do we improve? How do we do better? We know from COP, we can't be doing better than nothing. And that's really obvious to us probably, is that we need to think differently about how we're asking questions, right? Does Frosted Mini Wheats improve children's breakfast? We can't be comparing it to starving. So what's the alternative, right? In the field of nutrition, there's an obvious answer, right? We're not comparing Frosted Mini Wheats to nothing and then Special K to nothing and Crispus to nothing, nor could we just develop a study where we compared all these cereals against each other because they vary in so many different ways, right? What we do as scientists is we study variables, right? And so nutrition science has taken food and broken it down into components, into variables that can be studied. So we might instead test Frosted Mini Wheats versus not Frosted Mini Wheats. And then we can learn about sugar. We could test Frosted Mini Wheats, the time, the number of hours before school in which a kid eats Frosted Mini Wheats. Also, they said did well in school. We also need to understand mediation, right? Like, what does that mean? What does performance look like? Is it attentiveness? Is it doing well in class? Is it how long they stay awake? Is it do they raise their hand? There's personality differences around that, right? So understanding mediation and moderation. So applying that to residential energy use in buildings, I saw a lot of work when I started graduate school that kept talking about so I forgot about this one. So what we did in an attempt to try and translate, we developed kind of a nutrition label for behavior. So if we think instead of fat, sodium, carbohydrates. We've broken this down into the ABCs. And so we think of variables in terms of audience, behavior, content delivery, and then evaluation, those metrics. And so when you think of any behavioral program, these are all different levers, right, that we can push, that we can look at. We can look at frequency and duration and audience segmentation and messaging strategy and heuristics, right, and all these different things, images and icons, whatever. So this gives us a vocabulary to share with practitioners with which to kind of bring them up to talking with us about science and about applying psychology. So I started thinking about this and thinking when it came to energy use, how could we, because, you know, John Oliver just talked about food and isn't that fun? How could we make our building energy use more like a grocery store, right? Not that there's Doritos everywhere, but grocery stores are great environments. You have so much data. In addition to the nutrition label you have on every piece of food, food has prices, right? So when you leave, if you go to Safeway, that's a grocery store here in California, when you leave, you get a bill and it's itemized by each thing you eat. But our energy use, our building energy use isn't like that. Instead, imagine if you could just go to Safeway whenever you wanted, or Trader Joe's or Aldi or wherever you shop, you could get whatever food you want and they just sent you a bill at the end of the month. And you were like, $527. Should I eat less ramen or should I eat less blueberries, right? And that's what our energy environment looks like at home, right? We just get, for most of us, we're getting more and more data. Now, when I started doing my doctoral work in 2008, we were getting very little data beyond this, but there was this potential with smart meters to increase the frequency and the granularity of information. I was studying psychology. I learned about, you know, the initial Thorndike's theory of effect going back to 1905. Feedback intervention theory is among the oldest in the entire field of psychology. Our earliest publications were over 100 years ago. How do we apply this? But again, I didn't want to just look at, so I started with a meta-analysis. Is feedback effective? Overall, there had been 100+ studies looking at feedback given back to somebody about the energy use in their home or workplace. And we saw that there was a mean R effect size of about just under 12%, 0.1174. And it was a highly significant finding. And the average energy savings was somewhere in the 9 to 12% range. But we saw significant variability. The heterogeneity in the mean effect size was more statistically significant than the mean itself, right? Which means this is a silly question. A better question, if I didn't hit it with the John Oliver clip, is how and for whom is feedback effective? Under what conditions? And we identified a bunch of moderators. And what this gives us, if you look here, is a research agenda. So I spent the next 4 years of my dissertation running studies, multiple studies, and years since, actually now in the private sector, working with organizations, government entities like EU-DG Klima and private entities like O-Power and Uplight in the United States, trying to understand how can we do better than nothing with programs that are giving information to people. So then if we move on to relevant theory, we've gotten all these variables, but how do we know what type might work better? Or if message makes a difference, how do I start to think about, right, what messages we could develop to make a difference, to do better than nothing, right? So if we think about those traditional levers of carrots and sticks, we realize that those only go so far. As one of my favorite, I think it was Derek Sivers said it about 5 to 10 years ago, if information and motivation were enough, we'd all be skinny billionaires. We know it's not, right? That's the information and motivation work great for Spock, not so much for Homer. We might need to think about nudges. We might need to think about message framing. We might need to think about other strategies, right? And so there's all these theories. So I'm just going to give a couple examples of ones that we've thought through and applied and worked with partners on. So one, I love bringing back old theories, like really old papers that it's hard to read the writing on them. And this was one of my favorites. It's called The Magic Number 7 ± 2. And it talks about information capacity processing. And so in our brains, it's hard for us to keep track of more than 7 ± 2 data points. Think about things like phone numbers and zip codes. Like we're really built to not keep strings. That doesn't mean that we can't process, we can't understand, we can't retain more than 7 ± 2. It just means it's harder. And when we increase the amount of data we're taking in, like maybe looking into the night sky, not where I live in Venice Beach, but when I got out to Joshua Tree this past weekend, I could see so many stars. And one of the ways that we can make sense of complex data is by connecting dots. That's also called perceptual assistance. So thinking about that energy use, when we thought about going from one data point a month up to potentially daily use, 30 data points a month, hourly use, right? 15-minute use, or even real-time use, we're talking about up to 2 billion data points a year. Well, gosh, our brains are going to just explode, right? So how do we do that? So we did a simple experiment, and we've been running more like this, just looking at like going from 7, showing people a week of energy use, to a month. And we found that when we went from 7 to 30, we asked people both questions about their perception. Do you like this graph? Would you be interested in looking at this information? Would you keep this? Would you share this? And then we also asked them to interpret. So we asked 3 literacy questions, and we found in both, when we went from 7 to 31, literacy went down, ability to process went down, and actually interest in the information went down. But when we added perceptual assistance, here we just colored the weekends to show a meaningful pattern. We found that it had no impact on the top row, but it attenuated all losses. And actually the bottom right was the most preferred, and the graph with highest literacy. So that's one kind of way. It's simple, but we need to take these theories and really work with, if we just get this far, you can't just send the magic number 7 plus or minus 2 to a policymaker and go like, so obviously that psychology can improve your program, right? We need to think through translational science. How are we translating our theory? One of my absolute favorite studies, Jess Nolan, who was just down the street from me in San Diego, did her master's thesis looking at social normative influence. She wrote a paper called Social Normative Influence is Highly Underestimated, in which they found if you told people, please save energy, and they gave them 4 options, which of these 4 would be most likely to affect you? If you got these 4 messages, which one do you think would change your behavior? And people said in order on the screen: first, save money, that would be the most effective. Second, it's good for the planet. Third, being a good citizen. And the last one, my neighbors are doing it. That would not change my behavior at all whatsoever, because I think I'm Spock, and Spock would never be affected by something like that. But guess what? I'm Homer, right? And so what they did was they took that within the same community in North San Diego County, they did an experiment where they randomly assigned people to get door hangers with one of these 4 messages. And lo and behold, the most effective was the one that people thought would work the least, right? And that's been applied, which is the social norm message. And that's been applied most famously by a company that was founded just over a decade ago by Alex Lasky, OPower, which is now a subsidiary of Oracle Utilities. They were acquired for about $565 million. Imagine that, based primarily on a psychological insight. Alex was reading about Robert Cialdini, Jess Nolan, Wes Schultz's research, and thought, what if I could develop a program around it? And more impressive than that are the carbon emissions that they've been able to deem via numerous intervention studies showing that they're leading to savings compared to control groups. Another that I think is really important that I love is, I put here Rogers protection motivation theory, but also Al Bandura talked a lot about the dual model of efficacy, right? That when we think about our likelihood to act in the face of a threat is based on both our perception of the threat perception, and our perception of our ability to cope, coping appraisal, threat appraisal and coping appraisal, coping, otherwise known as behavioral efficacy. That threat perception, I think somebody said earlier tonight, clear and present danger. Thank goodness we're not talking that much about whether climate change is real anymore. But I think where we really, really don't do the best job is in really getting efficacy. A lot of people, and Roger says that if people are high in threat efficacy and low in coping efficacy, or high in threat appraisal and low in coping appraisal, that we see not action, but anxiety, right? And we're seeing a lot of climate anxiety. It's one of the highest increases. We actually, one of our newest projects with Blue Shield of California is looking at climate anxiety, specifically in BIPOC youth populations, actually. And so we really need to hit the head a little better on both identifying actions people can do and connecting them to impact. And research is showing that actually messaging around and encouraging people to take collective action attenuates climate anxiety even more than individual action. And then other examples, even if you're talking about an individual behavior, this is one of I love Susie Cameron's book, One Meal a Day, just talking about
showing the impact, right? Like maybe not everyone in America is going to go vegan. Telling people that your only option is eating meat or being an asshole, right? You're on behavior efficacy. I might not feel ready to make that shift, but just one person eating one plant-based meal a day will save all this water, the equivalent in carbon of driving from Los Angeles to New York City. And then there's tons of examples in her work and work like this that shows these behaviors, if individually, this is the impact, collectively, this is the impact. And then of course, the last one I'll talk about in theory is default theory. Make no decision the best decision. Some of you are probably really familiar with this graph. This is an actual graph of organ donation rates in Western Europe. So we see right towards the middle, like Germany and Austria, who to an American seem like very similar cultures, 12% versus 99.98%. Wow, are Austrians really that much better people than Germans? That seems strange. What could explain it? Obviously, it's program design. It's not anything about the people themselves. It's whether organ donation is a default. So in Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Poland, so on, if you do nothing, if you are born and you live your life and you die, the default is that your organs can be donated. In the 4 countries on the left, Denmark, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Germany, at least as of 2003, those countries you had to opt in. Where I live in California, you have to opt in. You have to add a donor dot to the back to your driver's license. And if you do not do that, if you don't sign up to be an organ donor, you can't donate, and our organ donation rates are low. We actually worked on a project on that when I was at the Herman Lear Center, actually combining this with a media intervention where we tried to educate people about the fact that our defaults are not in the direction that optimizes for organ donation. But one of the ways we're applying that with energy is we're working right now on 100% renewable energy default programs, where right now in California, a lot of cities are participating in something called CCA, or community choice aggregation. And that's where the city takes back procurement power from the investor-owned utility and defaults people over into the city plan. And several cities are working towards Santa Barbara as the next enrollment that we're working on, where instead of opting people, but instead of defaulting people into a plan that has about the same renewable portfolio and the same cost, they're opting people into 100% energy default. There are risks to that. It does increase opt-out rates because people might go, oh, wow, you opted me into something that costs more. So we're also working on how do we develop a messaging strategy around that so that we can maintain that 100% energy default without losing too many customers who just go, oh, I don't want to be part of this plan. I want to go back to my investor-owned utility. So last, applying appropriate methods, right? So we develop the right questions, we really think through variables, and then once we found the right questions, we've drilled in on what we want to know, we apply theory, we develop hypotheses based on that theory, and then we get to collect data if we're lucky. And so like many of you, we apply. So I feel very blessed. I call myself a psychologist, but my training was actually in something called social ecology, which is applied interdisciplinary behavioral science. And I feel very fortunate because I was trained to be very multi-method, and I'm lucky. And I think a lot of us at our best really have gone even beyond our training to realize like, I might have a PhD, someone might have a PhD in social psychology and didn't have a lot of exposure to qual or ethnography, but you can kind of collaborate. And that's where team science, working with other behavioral scientists is so useful, because I really think a multi-method approach is fantastically useful for really understanding interventions and really being able to marry inferential approaches where we're looking at kind of averages with more of like thick description and deep qualitative approaches where we're really getting into the nuance. I think they play very well together. So I'll share an example. So these are business energy reports. So kind of building on that feedback study, O-Power, we worked with a company named Pulse, who was trying to do what O-Power did, but for business. And so we were brought on to try and improve the efficacy of their business energy reports. They were currently getting about And this sounds really small. They were getting about 0.7% savings and their goal was 0.9. So they had to go up 0.2%, which sounds small, but again, that leads to huge savings. So what we did was first, we worked with them and we identified all these theories, what personalization, social norms, all the things, we applied relevant theory. Then we did a UX study where we gave people eye trackers and we looked at how they were interacting with the reports and asked them what they did. So we got really deep insights and we saw things like they were boring holes in the images and not focusing that much on the words. They were really looking at banners and headers. So based on that, we developed a set of hypotheses from the qual. We went into a round of A/B testing and we started testing things like having every single solitary word identical. Were people more likely to take action if the picture had a person as opposed to it didn't? And we found a statistically significant difference. We also found if we changed from just that basic rebates available to something specific, we increased the effectiveness. We found if we changed the header, the heading at the top, from a noun to a verb, from ceiling fans to use fans more, we saw an increase. So what we were able to see was a ton. We actually ran 29 studies and we identified 14 statistically significant variables. When you put all those back together again, you can see we're starting to really use psychological science to develop programs that are better than nothing. And this truly is just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, proving the universal through the specific, there are a ton of different program strategies within the ecosystem of influencing building energy use. Energy reports, this little red circle at the bottom, is just one of them. And then of course, building electricity use is just one part of our carbon footprint. Even this image doesn't have food on it. That's a loss. And then even here, when we look at our carbon footprint, that's really focusing on individual level behavior and mitigation. We also need to be looking at collective behavior, as well as increasingly adaptation, work on flooding, like work I did in my postdoc and the work we're starting to do on climate anxiety. So truly, if I could say one thing, it's that we really do science, and psychological science has so much to contribute. We are an important piece of the puzzle, and I'm so excited that more and more of us are getting involved in this important work. Thanks.
Beth, thank you. That was brilliant. I'm going to go ahead and bring in our panelists, who are Wendy Jeremy, who's representing the Trinidadian and Tobago Psychological Association, Irina Fagina, who represents the American Psychological Association's, here she is, United Nations team, and Pascal Neri Jean Charles, doctor, I should say, who is the current president of the Haitian Psychological Association and participates in GPA. So I just put out there, kind of curious, because I think your data is really compelling and your experiments and studies are fascinating. Curious if they have ideas about how they might share the science that you've been working on with their kind of like, let's just say, typical member in their organization, and in the context of the sorts of things that they're struggling with perhaps on a day-to-day basis, whether or not it's working in private practice or clinic or training students or who knows. So we'll go ahead and start with Pascal, if that's okay, and then continue with Wendy and Irina. Go ahead, Pascal.
Hello, everyone. So I'm really glad to be here tonight. So it was an interesting presentation. So I think it's really important, the question that she start with, why psychology is important for climate change? Because a lot of people is asking themselves in what way we can help to change the behavior of the people with psychology. When they're thinking about climate change, they're not always thinking about psychology. And I think it's really important to what putting emphasis in the studies. It's really important that we have more research on how behavior, what is the motivation of the person, how we can study the perception of the person around their nature. For example, in Haiti, we have a lot of people that they used to cut trees, they throw things everywhere, but all those things, they are behavior. But what is really important is that it's not only individual behavior, it's collective behavior. So how the collective behavior is affecting the individual behavior, and how we can know best the motivation of the person, because sometimes we think that if we give the information that will do everything, but with those studies, it's really important that we go deeper and we try to understand what is the motivation of the people and how the people and collectivity, how the collectivity is affecting the individual behavior towards nature. I think it's really important. Those theory and something that is really important. She talked about anxiety. Yes, a lot of people may have anxiety when they heard about climate change. So anxiety can be can make people don't really act the best way because they don't know. Anxiety can freeze people sometimes because when you are a lot of stress, so you can don't know really what is the best behavior to have or not. So I think those are really good consideration. And something that is really important that she mentioned is about when she was talking about, when she was highlighting the social norm, the first thing that she said that people can sometimes have a behavior because they want to save money. So, so I think all those considerations is really important when we're thinking about the motivation, the perception of the people, and all those things. So I think it's really amazing those discussion. And I think what we can do is to our colleagues is to promote more science. So we have to do more research around everything. On every specific behavior. Now we were talking about energy, but we should do the same for all those things that is related to climate change, so we can have a better understanding about the motivation of the people. And we know that the motivation of the people can be different from the local geography where they have, for the race, for the sex. So we should have more information so we can do better intervention in a large way.
Yeah, those are great points. It'd be fascinating to look at a kind of and maybe this exists, and so pardon my ignorance if it does, but a cross-cultural comparison, right? So what we're seeing with US samples, if the motivating factors look similar, whether it's in Haiti, Trinidad, Tobago, and so on. So thank you, Pascal. Wendy?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me so that I'm learning myself. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we tend not to take things on that don't affect us personally. If it's not affecting us, we don't take it on. So we know that climate is changing. We have to recognize it. Climate will continue to change, and we have to prepare for it. And climate is changing our lives. We have to contend with it. And so in Trinidad and Tobago, in order for us not to remain as we are now, because there's a lot of resistance to the COVID vaccine, I think it is absolutely necessary to prepare the members of our population for climate change, because it is here. There's no running away from it. So in order not for us to stay in this mode now, we are going to prepare for it. And how do we do that? We ask an alternative question. We ask the alternative question. We can ask members of the population, why did you receive 4 bulbs from TNTech, your electric company? Some might tell us, well, to save money. Some might say to save the planet. We don't know. I don't know the answers. Because I also found in asking my students, I said, do you know about climate change? Some didn't quite know. My clients, young boys, I said, do you know about climate change? One of them knew. And I gave them homework to go and find out about it. My students, I said, listen, at the end of the semester, I'm giving you an essay on climate change. So which means they have to be sensitized. Psychologists can let the population, we have to, with respect to climate change, acknowledge how people feel and talk about it, because climate change will take a toll on our mental health. And we do so by, we can design strategies, understanding what people currently believe and know about climate change. So against the backdrop of changing their behavior and the society away from some of the things that they do, some of the harmful activities that they do, and putting them in the way of towards a reduction in, say, the personal carbon emissions. What do we mean by all of that? So they may say, well, I shouldn't use my car, or we shouldn't drive our cars to go to town, to Port of Spain. Less emission. We might want to take a bus that is a little better for us. Or we might want to walk from this point to that point, or ride. Those are the things we have to let people understand about climate change, the impact it has on us. And we have to identify the barriers that prevent people from changing their behavior. We have to communicate the why and the how that needs to be, all that needs to be taken. And we may want to mount like debates concerning this, but too much talking in the debates must go towards action. Otherwise, there's no moving anywhere. You see? So in Trinidad, we have to make people more aware. Just 2 days ago, I heard a program, somebody talking on television about a youth empowerment program. But in her terms of reference, I did not hear anything about climate change. And this is for young people. And then in the evening, I heard a lady talking about the environment and something geared towards the youth, which is very important. So we have to ask different questions of them, see how much people know about climate change. And as I say, sometimes we don't take it on because it doesn't affect us, but it has affected us with the amount of flooding that has taken place, the amount of flooding. And through flooding, we have lost neighborhoods, and what a toll it has taken on us, because it has produced loss, grief. Could you imagine that the people, you know, after you build up this neighborhood for years, all of that is gone. Some people have had to leave that to go to another community to live. So that all of that is climate change. We have to understand what is happening. And to do so, we must educate, devise programs, you see, and the only way people change is when it affects them. You know, the drive behind attitude change is what they feel inside. So we have to know what they feel, you know, and we mustn't leave it, let them leave it for anybody to do, a superhero to do. We want comfort, a sense of helplessness, you know?
Yeah, that's a great point, Wendy, about, and I think it's been a recurring point about how much of what motivates us to change starts at a very personal level. And in some ways, particularly if we're doing more kind of clinical or educational work, which is frequent in psychology, that there's flooding, but it's not really my livelihood. Or so, yeah, I appreciate that. Irina, what kinds of...
Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be with you, Beth. Thank you for your talk. I think reflecting on your talk and also the question that you posed, Amanda, I think what I would highlight is that psychology can be helpful at multiple points of trying to get people to engage. So first of all, we have the ability to understand our audiences and learn about people. And we have ways of, you know, gathering information and getting actually connected to communities and all of that. So that's a huge thing that we can offer. And then through doing that, we can also identify what the barriers are to action. And those could be more kind of large scale, or they might be much more specific and in details, but we have ways of really looking deeply into what's going on for people and helping and figuring out, you know, where is the, even if the motive is there, where is it getting interrupted, not leading to action. And then once we've identified that, we then have all these tools in our toolbox for how to address them. So Beth mentioned nudges, and then you know, different forms of engagement, designing things in a way that really works with our cognitive process and our motivational process, thinking about social norms and our need to be part of our communities and society and fit in and be accepted and all of that. These are all tools, and depending on what the situation is that you're in, you can draw on those tools to pick the one that will actually get over the barriers. And then I think the last thing, which is really helpful, is the ability to test and figure out if the stuff we're doing is working, which in my experience in the government, for example, is a wonderful contribution because there's a lot of policy insight, there's a lot of intuition that people build up through their experience. But sometimes as they're bringing programs into new places or scaling them up, they don't work the way that one may imagine. So the capacity to actually pilot test stuff and have those research skills and know how to structure that experiment and know how to get data that really informs your question is also really valuable. So I think those three things together can be brought into pretty much any setting, and then of course adapted to what the needs are of the situation.
Thank you, Irina. Did you have any follow-up comments, Beth, before we move on to questions? No? Oh, okay. To kind of bring this together, Pascal, Wendy, Irina, Beth, your extraordinary expertise and thoughtful comments. There's some questions that get to the point of behavior change. And so just kind of collapsing ideas. One of those specifically addresses the point of how do you create behavior change when it's out of balance with economic realities? That is, there are perhaps lots of things that we can encourage people to do that would actually cost a lot more money. Let's say buy an electric car. That has been, a thing. I'm kind of picking a big example, but or even things like solar panels end up being, quite an expensive investment. Or is behaviorism too much of it's a criticism we hear, as psychologists, is it too much of a treating humans as if they were animals, just, reward response kind of creatures who don't put any real thought or emotion into the ways in which they're interacting with their broader environment. So I'll hand that to you, Beth, and then if either Pascal, Wendy, or Irina want to add, they can do so subsequently.
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is really looking at that. Like the example I gave about enrolling people in 100% renewable, this 100% opt-in, what we're doing is, and what a lot of governments are doing is, that increases the cost. That's increasing the cost of the same exact electricity. Your television plays the same shows, whether you're getting coal or whether you're getting solar, right? Your pizza gets just as hot in the oven, your beer stays just as cold in the fridge. And so what we're trying to do is kind of align our longer term benefits, our longer term goals with our immediate term actions. We're also doing work, actually, we're doing a study right now on electric vehicle purchase, as well as electrification within the building, within the home, of kitchen, switching out water, heat pumps with electric. And this deep decarbonization, our goals as a country and as we're coming out of COP as a planet of deep decarbonization rely on moving to renewables. The payback is not immediate. Similar to the payback of behaviors that feel good if we think about our health. Smoking cigarettes and eating certain foods might feel really good in the short term, but in the long-term health of your body, they're not the right choice. So I think some of it's a reframe of thinking about like individual versus collective and now versus later, and our brains are not programmed to think. We temporally discount, right? People in studies are more likely to want $5 in their hands than a $20 check that would be mailed to them in 1 week. We've seen that over and over in studies with like incentive structures. And so I think what we're really doing is marketing, right? Like people will pay more for certain blue jeans than another pair if they're a different brand. What we're trying to do is align people's choices with the world they want to see for their children rather than their immediate pocketbook, while allowing the freedom for people to make decisions for themselves, while we're also promoting collective action, so that when we do have, at some point, these things will be regulated, right? Like in 100 years, we're probably, gas vehicles are not going to be allowed to be made or sold in our country. Right now, we're kind of pushing choice so that we can start moving enough people along the diffusion curve so that once we hit kind of a tipping point, it'll be easier for regulation to pick up the laggards. So it's a step along the way. I think social marketing is a part of the collective behavior process. If we just regulate before anyone's changed a behavior, you would get too much violent pushback, as we've seen with some of our COVID policies. So this is a step in a really positive policy shift.
I believe people must know why we're going to electric cars. We heard that about electric cars in Trinidad with respect to our budget. That's what the Minister of Finance said. But our Prime Minister said when he came back from COP26 that there's a transition of the workforce policy aimed at upskilling, retooling, developing a new capacity for a low carbon economy. So people must understand why we have to go with electric cars, you know? So we have to educate them along the way. Marketing, we have to do it all the time because, you know, they just can't lap it up. And some of them, the mechanics might be getting a little worried, but oh gosh, I mightn't have the skills. But programs are in place to upskill them to suit the electric. That's just one example of it. I think people from the public must know. They must know why we're doing certain things. We have to engage them well so they understand it and not, you know, just think it's somebody else's job. But it's us. We have to do it individually to save ourselves, you know, for a better world and to leave a better world for young people, some of them who are thinking about not bringing children to the world. So for those who are not yet born, we don't want extinction. We want to make the world a better place. So they have to be educated. That's what I think.
And you know, Wendy, that's a great point in some ways that like psychology has a lot to say about how to communicate effectively with people in terms of change. And so certainly there's a role there. I'm curious if Pascal and Irina, in just our last 2 minutes, you know, sometimes I feel like it's actually Roberto, if he's still here, he may have had to leave, but you know, very often will say to me, not in these words because he's very elegant, but you know, easy for you to say, Amanda, right? You live in Washington, D.C. If you lived in Nicaragua, the realities of kind of like, how are you going to make an argument in terms of like $5 or $20 is a much more tenuous decision because people are living in a very day-to-day kind of you know, economic environment or socio-political environment where it's hard to count on a meaningful policy and that the government will follow up on what it says it's going to do, or people are focused so much on basic survival. Like it's a luxury for me to say, should I install solar panels? It's so expensive. And so I'm just kind of in thinking about these ideas, if there are any, and if any of you, all of you, you know, have experience, I'll start with Pascal and Irina, since it's kind of just the order of things, thoughts on potentially contextual differences.
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about motivation, so we should consider that the motivation can be external, that can be internal. So well, the motivation and the internal motivation is the best motivation because it can last for a long time. But regarding what you were telling right now, so I really like the presentation of Rosamira. So I think we can take what she's doing there as an example about how we can make change on climate change in poor country as Haiti, because if we remember what she was saying, so people have to balance costs and benefits. So if we say an poor country to someone that he cannot do this, he cannot cut trees, but he don't have an alternative to be able to cook food, because in Haiti they cut tree to do charcoals. So we have to provide an alternative for that person. So if the person don't have alternative, he may know the information, but he may continue to he may know the information, he may understand why it's important, but he may not have too many choices to decide other ways. So it's really important in those countries that alongside the information, the motivation, we provide to those people alternative where they can make money with doing something positive with the climate, but at the same time they have a living way. So I think it's really important that we merge this kind of thing in the poor country. So it's really important that we involve the community because there's a lot of practice that is collectively acceptable. So in some communities, so they may have a way to behave, but everyone believe that is the good way to behave. So we should involve the community in the change also. That this is what I can add to what you just said.
We'll wrap up with Irina.
I resonate with all of those points, and I think what we've seen actually in the variety of talks even today is that at those different levels that you're talking about, Amanda, there's different barriers and challenges. So a financial barrier that's a serious thing, and then that would need to be addressed, for example, by giving people access to work, etc., and food. But then I think in a lot of other contexts, it's not so much such a tangible barrier, but more one of social norms that prevent people from doing things because they think it would be shameful or inappropriate or whatever. Or it might be habits, just changing habits. Like a lot of work in the developing world around sanitation is around providing resources, but then helping people shift really long-standing habits. So in a way, I think, and the other point I want to make is that we're always responding to our environment. It's not like if we don't design our environment well, we're somehow free actors, and if suddenly we get involved in thinking about how to optimize the environment, then we're controlling people. We're always creating environments for ourselves, for each other, policies, our ideological environments, etc. So I think the point is, the more intention we put into aligning those environments with people's actual long-term goals and making them just sort of more aligned with what will move things forward. I think that's kind of the purpose. And if it's happening at the level of, you just got to figure out exactly what the touch points are. Is it about financial inability to, engage? Is it about motivation? Is it about social pressures? Is it about ideological pushback, which is, something we face here, and it seems kind of very much a developed world problem, but boy, is it difficult to address, right? Sometimes more difficult than financial challenges. So I think that the point is that if we can be really attuned to where people are at and what their needs are and how to work with those needs to facilitate their engagement, and I think we have the tools for that. That's that can work in almost any setting.
Oh, it's nothing short of brilliant. Thank you all so much, Beth in particular, Pascal, Wendy, Irina, for the really enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. And we'll close tonight with a few comments and insights from our colleague, Dr. John Jamir Benson Arruda, who represents the Psychological Association of the Philippines. Go ahead, John, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. First of all, I would like to thank the Global Psychology Alliance for the opportunity to share my insights on the conference, Psychology in Action, Leading for the Climate. The day one of this conference provided meaningful reflections on how psychology can play a role in protecting the earth and the living beings that reside on it. I'm sharing my reflections on the presentations of Mark Foley, Dr. Brian Dixon, Rosamira Guillen, and Dr. Beth Carlin. More importantly, I am speaking today as an environmental psychologist representing the Global South and non-Western nations who are largely neglected in the scientific discussion in psychology broadly and in environmental psychology in particular. I also speak as an ordinary citizen in countries like the Philippines, who have very little contribution to greenhouse emission, but the ones facing the severe consequences of climate change. Allow me to start summarizing the important and complementing themes in today's presentations. The presentation of Mark Foley emphasized the importance of leadership in mitigating environmental problems. It is our duty to support local and global leaders who value the environment and the welfare of the future generations and make innovative policies and decisions that are science-based. We need leaders who can bring people and different sectors together to create innovative solutions in mitigating climate change. The presentation of Dr. Brian Dixon showed us effective models that can equip local governments in involving communities in climate mitigation efforts and highlighted how psychologists can contribute in these efforts. Dr. Dixon's presentation is particularly important to communities in developing countries where local governments have very limited resources and capacities to mitigate and respond to climate disasters. The presentation of Rosamira Guillen highlighted the importance of engaging the youth and locals in conservation actions. The engagement of the youth resonated with me. Given that today's youth will face the future consequences of the climate crisis, involving them and teaching them the importance of climate mitigation can go a long way. Additionally, coming from a non-Western country, I agree that communication strategies should be contextualized to each community, as people from different cultures can have different motivations in engaging in climate action. My own research looks at culture-specific correlates of environmental concern, attitudes, and engagement in non-Western context. The presentation of Dr. Beth Carlin emphasized opportunities for psychologists in helping encourage people to commit to energy efficient use through research. The research that she and her lab are doing provides meaningful insights for psychologists to utilize psychological principles in encouraging energy efficient behaviors. In the context of developing nations, people might have different motivations for conserving energy. For example, people might save energy because not saving energy for them means paying electricity bills equivalent to 1 month's groceries. Dr. Carlin's research offers more opportunities to focus on contextualized understanding of people's motivation for energy use. Given the strong link between human behavior and environmental problems, psychology indeed has an important role to play in addressing global environmental challenges. However, despite the global nature of environmental problems, scientific attention in the field of environmental psychology has largely focused on weird countries. By weird, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic nations. Therefore, there is a need to encourage and involve scholars in non-weird countries into the conversation. As an environmental psychologist in an underrepresented country like the Philippines, I can see the huge need for psychology to take part in the scientific pursuit in applying psychological principles for promoting sustainability and increasing the scientific interest of seasoned and aspiring psychologists in environmental psychology. This can be done by 1, research collaborations involving psychologists with expertise in environmental sustainability and scholars from the global south or non-Western nations. Established environmental psychologists providing supervision and training for aspiring scholars from underrepresented nations. Providing more research funding opportunities for scholars in the global south, to mention a few. I also speak as an ordinary citizen from a climate vulnerable country such as the Philippines. We have very little contribution to greenhouse emission, and yet we are the first to constantly face the severe consequences of climate change. At least 20 cyclones hit my country every year, some of which are categorized as super typhoons, killing thousands of people, destroying livelihoods and shelters every year. For example, in 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan, if you remember, that's the strongest typhoon ever recorded. It devastated the Philippines, killing at least 6,000 people and damaging homes. Many people still do not have houses to live in until now due to the devastation caused by Haiyan. Countries like the Philippines have to face the consequences for the environmental actions that we are not mainly responsible for. We hope for further collective action in addressing environmental problems and attention to those who are weak and vulnerable from the brunt of the climate crisis. We appreciate the effort of the COP26 and individual countries and citizens in doing their part in addressing global environmental challenges. I also appreciate the steps taken by the Global Psychology Alliance, the Psychological Association of the Philippines, the American Psychological Association, in promoting the role of psychology in preserving planetary health. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my insights through this platform. Thank you.
Dr. Benson, that was the perfect ending, I think, to a really extraordinary evening here on the East Coast, morning for some of you, afternoon for others. Thank you so much. And this has been compelling in that it makes, I think, probably all of us want to continue this conversation, hopefully. Certainly motivates us to really think about our next step. So with much gratitude, thank you. Thank you, everybody who's been here with us this evening. We're going to meet tomorrow, Starting at 8:45, we have another handful of presenters, and everyone is more than welcome. And certainly we look forward to continue to solve this problem together with psychological science. So much appreciated, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.